The town of Ridgeback Gulch announced itself the way most Wyoming towns did. A water tower, a grain elevator, and a church steeple rising out of the grass before anything else was visible. Cole Dantry had been walking since before dawn, the April wind coming off the Laramie Range with enough cold in it to make a man's eyes water, and he was glad enough to see any collection of buildings that promised a roof and a meal. He had 31 cents in his pocket and a saddle over his left shoulder. The saddle had belonged to his father. It was the only thing worth taking when he'd walked off the Dantry flats 5 years ago, and it was the only thing he still owned that had weight to it, real weight, the kind that came from meaning rather than mass. A man could sell his coat. A man could sell his boots if it came to that. Cole Dantry had decided sometime during the second year of walking other men's land that he would not sell the saddle. It had become a private article of faith. The town had one main street unpaved with boardwalks along either side that had been repaired so many times they looked like a quilt. A bank on the north end, a general store, a saloon with a painted sign that had faded to near illegibility, a post office the size of a large closet wedged between the barber and the telegraph office. At the south end, set back from the street on a small rise, a white-painted schoolhouse with a covered porch and windows on three sides. One of the windows had a board nailed over it where the glass had broken. Cole noticed the board because he noticed things. 23 panes of glass in the remaining windows, shingles missing from the northwest corner of the roof, probably 2, maybe 3 courses, based on the water staining visible on the eave. The porch steps had been repaired with green lumber that had since warped. A building tells you what its people have and don't have. This one said pride but not money. He went to the general store first on the theory that general store proprietors usually knew who needed what done. The man behind the counter was heavy-set, bald at the crown, with the kind of face that had settled permanently into pleasant neutrality. "Passing through or staying?" the man asked without preamble. "Depends on whether there's work." The man considered him, not unfriendly, just measuring. "You do carpentry." "Enough. Schoolhouse roof's been needing repair since October. Board of Education voted the money last month. Haven't found anyone who'll do it for what they're offering." He named a figure, $3 for a week's work with lumber provided. It was less than Cole had hoped for. It was more than nothing. "When do I start?" Cole said. He was directed to the schoolhouse and told to speak with the teacher, Mrs. Ashford, who managed the building and had final say on contractors. Cole walked up the rise and knocked on the schoolhouse door at 10:30 in the morning. Children's voices went quiet inside. The woman who opened the door was somewhere in her late 30s, with auburn hair pinned back with the focused efficiency of someone who doesn't think about her hair much. She had gray eyes that assessed him quickly and completely, the way a teacher's eyes do, trained to read a room in 2 seconds. "Yes," she said. "Cole Dantry. The general store sent me about the roof." She looked at him, at his saddle, at the state of his boots. "Do you have references?" she said. "Not within a day's ride." A brief pause. "Can you show me what's wrong with it?" The northwest corner, 2 or 3 courses of shingles gone probably from last fall's wind. "There's water damage on the interior ceiling, I'd guess, in the northeast-facing corner of the room." He paused. "And the porch steps are going to need replacing before winter. Whoever used green lumber on them was in a hurry." She studied him for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door. "The ceiling stain is in the east corner," she said. "You were close." He wasn't certain whether that was approval. The children were 9 of them, ranging from 6 to 14, arranged in rows with slates in front of them. They stared at Cole with the frank curiosity children are reserved for strangers and large animals. He nodded at them collectively. A few nodded back. "Back to your arithmetic," Mrs. Ashford said, and they bent obediently to their slates. She led Cole through a side door and around the exterior to the northwest corner, where she stood with her arms crossed and looked up at the roofline. "The Board of Education approved $3, she said. "The lumber is already here." She gestured to a stack of planks under a tarpaulin near the porch. "Do you need anything else?" "A ladder. There's one in the lean-to. Then I can start tomorrow morning." She nodded once businesslike and turned to go back inside. Then she stopped. "Where are you staying?" "I'll find somewhere. The Peck boarding house on Elm Street charges 40 cents a night. They're clean and they don't water the coffee." She said it the way you'd give directions to a person who looked like they might need them. Not unkind, not warm, simply practical. "Thank you," Cole said. She went back to her children. Cole stood in the schoolyard for a moment looking up at the roofline. The wind moved through the grass at the edge of the rise. Somewhere in the distance, cattle. He put the saddle more firmly on his shoulder and went to find the Peck boarding house. The Peck boarding house was run by a woman named Delia Peck, who was 62, thin as a fence rail, and had opinions about everything from the proper boiling time for potatoes to the current state of federal land policy. She told Cole her views on both subjects within the first 10 minutes of his arrival, while showing him to a room that was small, clean, and cold in the way of rooms that faced north. "We have another long-term boarder," she said, pausing at the room across the hall. "An older woman, Ruth Dantry. She's been with us since December." Cole set down his saddle very carefully. Well, he said, his voice level. Delia Peck looked at him with new attention. "She's your mother." "Yes, ma'am." She didn't mention a son coming. She didn't know. Delia Peck was quiet for a moment. Then, "She has good days and bad days. Today is a middling day. She's resting." She paused again. "She talks about the ranch sometimes, in her sleep mostly." "Yes," Cole said, "she would." Ruth Dantry was asleep when Cole looked in, and he didn't wake her. He stood in the doorway of her room for a long time, long enough to register the sound of her breathing, which had a rough quality to it that hadn't been there 3 years ago, the last time he'd seen her. Long enough to note the Bible on her bedside table, the way her hands were folded over the quilt. Even in sleep, the faded photograph of the Dantry homestead on the windowsill, where the afternoon light would catch it. He pulled the door softly closed and went downstairs. He ate supper alone at the kitchen table. Delia Peck was a forthright woman, but she understood when a man needed quiet and thought about $3 in a boarding house that cost 40 cents a night, and a mother who was sleeping with the roughness of bad lungs in a room he was paying for with someone else's charity. After supper, he went back upstairs and sat in the chair beside his mother's bed and waited. She woke at dusk. She turned her head and saw him and was quiet for a moment. "Cole," she said. "Hey, Mama." She looked at him the way she always had, the complete searching look of a mother taking inventory, checking what the years had done, noting what had worn away and what had held. "You're thin," she said. "I'm fine. You walked here." He didn't answer. "I can tell from your boots," she said. "Sit up straight." He sat up straight. She almost smiled. They talked for an hour, carefully, the way you talk around the thing that matters most. She asked about where he'd been working. He told her about ranches in Colorado, a cattle drive out of Laramie, a fence-building job that had lasted 4 months and paid better than most. She told him about Ridgeback Gulch, about Delia Peck's opinions on everything, about the school teacher, Mrs. Ashford, who had come from back east and was doing better than most people expected. She told him these things in the observational tone of a woman who has learned to find the world interesting because the alternative is despair. She did not say, "When are you going to stop running?" She did not say, "I am afraid I will die before you find your way back to land." She did not say any of the things a mother might say to a son who had spent 5 years in motion since losing everything. But when he stood to leave for the night, she caught his hand. "The schoolhouse job," she said. "Do it right." "I always do." "I know," she said. "I mean, stay long enough to do it right. Don't be in a hurry to move on." He stood there with his hand in hers for a moment. "All right," he said. Miriam Ashford had a system. She had developed it over years of teaching, first in Philadelphia, and then in 3 increasingly remote locations as she followed Edmund's optimistic sense of opportunity, westward Cincinnati, then St. Louis, then here. The system was simple. Every important document got copied into her record book, a large green ledger she'd bought in Philadelphia before they left, filled now with years of transcriptions, inventories, correspondence, copies, school board minutes, attendance records, and the occasional personal notation disguised as administrative language. Edmund had understood the system and respected it. He'd called her record book her second mind, affectionately, not mockingly. He'd been a gentle man, Edmund, impractical but genuinely gentle. The strongbox had been under the bed since she arrived in Ridgeback Gulch 18 months ago. She'd opened it twice for insurance documents, and once for their marriage certificate, which she'd needed for a legal matter related to Edmund's debts. She had not, until this rainy Thursday evening in April, opened the large inner envelope marked land. She had not been ready. Now she sat at her kitchen table with the papers spread in front of her and read them carefully twice before getting out her record book and copying the relevant details. The description of the parcel, 640 acres bottomland and upland mixed South Bank of Prentice Creek, Wyoming Territory. The date of filing November 14th, 1881. The purchase price, Edmund had paid $240, which explained certain financial puzzlements from that period, the notary stamp information, and the filing number. She did not know exactly what the deed meant for her current situation. She did know that 640 acres along a creek sounded significant. She did know that Edmund had spent $240 on it, which was not the behavior of a man who thought he was buying nothing. She closed the record book, put the original deed back in the envelope, and sat for a moment listening to the rain on the roof. Then she put on her coat and walked to the bank. Harlan Voss kept long hours. The light was still on in his office when Miriam knocked on the glass door of Voss and Associates, and he looked up from his desk with a smile that managed to seem both surprised and warmly welcoming, as though her arrival was a pleasant coincidence he had somehow anticipated. He was a handsome man for 52, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that wore authority naturally and smile mild with practiced ease. 3 women in town had mentioned to Miriam in the conversational way women mention such things that Harlan Voss had been widowed 4 years ago and had not remarried and that he was considered a catch. Miriam had not been looking for catches. She showed him the deed. Voss read it. His expression was carefully composed, interested, helpful, measured. But something moved behind his eyes, a brief recalculation quick as a blink. "Prentice Creek," he said, "that's valuable bottom land. Your husband was a smart man to file on it. Is it worth anything, the claim I mean? Is it still valid after Edmund's passing?" "Deeds transfer with the estate," Voss said. "You'd be the holder now." He held the paper up to his lamp. "I'll need to look into the filing records more closely. There can be complications with territory claims, bureaucratic matters. Nothing serious usually." He smiled. "Leave it with me. I'll look into it." "I'd rather keep the original," Miriam said. A very small pause. "Of course," Voss said warmly. "Very sensible." He handed it back. "I'll come by the schoolhouse tomorrow. I may have some questions." Miriam thanked him and left. Walking home in the rain, she had the faint, uncomfortable feeling she sometimes got when a student was giving her an answer that was technically correct but not quite true. She couldn't have said why. Voss had been perfectly helpful. She went home and made sure her record book was in the locked drawer of her desk. Cole started on the schoolhouse roof Monday morning and was making good progress by Wednesday when the sky turned the yellow-gray color that meant weather and then delivered on the promise in the early afternoon. He was 2/3 through the northwest corner repairs when the rain began. He considered stopping. The shingles he'd already laid were set they wouldn't be damaged by rain, and he could tarp the remaining exposed section. But the tarp he had was old, and the wind was picking up, and there was a particular geometry to the repairs that he knew from experience would be significantly harder to execute correctly if the wood swelled with moisture overnight. He stayed. He worked through the rain, moving carefully on the wet slope, nailing shingles with the methodical patience that was his natural pace for most things. The children went home at 4 o'clock. He heard them through the noise of the rain, their voices fading down the hill. By 5 o'clock, the light was going, and he was nearly done, and his jacket was soaked through. A door opened below him. "Mr. Dantry." He looked down. Miriam Ashford stood on the porch holding 2 tin mugs. She was wearing an oilskin coat that was slightly too large for her, probably Edmund's, and she was looking up at him with an expression that was not quite concern and not quite exasperation. "Come down from there," she said. "You'll fall." "I won't fall." "You might." He set down his hammer and came down the ladder. She handed him a mug when he reached the porch. "Coffee hot, real coffee, not the watered-down kind." "Thank you," he said. "You didn't have to keep working in this." "I know." She looked out at the rain. "Will it hold the roof?" "Yes. Another day's work tomorrow on the east edge and it'll be solid." He drank the coffee. It was very good. "How's the ceiling inside?" "I put a bucket under the stain before the children arrived this morning. It didn't drip." She paused. "Which suggests your shingles are already working. Or the wind's coming from the south today." "Or that," she almost smiled. They stood on the covered porch while the rain came down on the schoolyard. It was the comfortable silence of people who are not uncomfortable with silence, which is a different thing from having nothing to say. "Where are you from?" she said eventually. "Here," Cole said. "Wyoming, southern part. A place called Dantry Flats." He paused. "Wasn't much of a town, just land." Another pause. "It's not ours anymore." Miriam turned to look at him. He was looking at the rain. "I'm sorry," she said. "How about you?" Philadelphia, the storekeeper said. "Born there. Married there." She wrapped both hands around her mug. Edmund had ideas about the West, about opportunity. He wasn't wrong exactly. The land here is extraordinary. He just didn't have enough time to do much with it. She said it flatly, the way you say things when you've said them enough times that the pain has worn a smooth groove. Cole nodded. He didn't offer condolences, which she appreciated. She'd had enough condolences to last a decade. Do you miss it? She said. The flats. Every day, he said, simply without drama. A fact. She looked at him. The plainness of it, the willingness to say a hard thing without softening it, was not what she'd expected from him. I miss Philadelphia, she said, but not the way I expected to. I miss the library and the sound of the streetcars. Silly things. Not silly. What do you miss? Cole was quiet for a moment. The creek in the morning, he said, the way the light came off it, and the smell after rain. He looked out at the wet schoolyard. Like this. They were quiet again. The rain continued. You can finish the coffee inside, she said. There's no sense standing out here. He followed her in. She poured more coffee from a pot on the small stove in the corner of the room she used as her office, a partitioned section at the back of the schoolhouse, barely large enough for a desk, 2 chairs, and a piano that dominated one wall, with the presence of a piece of furniture that had been carried a very long way and intended to stay. Cole looked at the piano. You play, he said. Every evening, she said. Edmund played too. It was one of the things. She stopped, started again. It was something we had in common. She sat down at her desk. Do you? No, she nodded. They drank their coffee and talked carefully around the edges of things the way strangers do when they're interested in each other but have learned to be careful about interest. He told her about ranch work. She told him about teaching children who arrived in January so cold their hands couldn't hold chalk. He asked about her plans for the summer session. She asked about his plans when the schoolhouse job was finished. He said he didn't know yet. She said Wyoming in summer was something a person should see before leaving. He said he'd keep that in mind. When he left, the rain had slowed to a thin mist. He walked back down the hill to the boarding house with his jacket still wet and the coffee still warm in him, and the careful, tentative feeling of a man who has noticed something unexpected in a direction he wasn't looking. Harlan Voss was a patient man. This was in his private accounting of himself, his greatest virtue. Lesser men acted quickly out of appetite or anxiety. Harlan Voss waited, watched the geometry of a situation develop until the optimal moment revealed itself. Then he moved. He had built Voss and Associates over 18 years, from a single land brokerage license and $200 in borrowed capital. He now held financial instruments on nearly a third of the viable ranch land in 3 Wyoming counties. He was a deacon. He served on the school board, in the town council, and the territorial water authority. He gave to the church's charity fund at Christmas and knew the name of every child in Ridgeback Gulch. He was by any reasonable measure the most important man in the county. He was also, if anyone had possessed both the knowledge and the courage to say so, the reason 14 families no longer owned the land they'd built their lives on. The Prentice Creek claim was different from his usual operations. Edmund Ashford had filed through the Cheyenne Territorial Office, not through Ridgeback's own land records, where Voss had long-standing relationships that made certain adjustments convenient. This meant the deed itself was genuinely filed and genuinely valid. The complication the tool Voss intended to use was the notary stamp. Early in his career, before he'd become quite so careful, Voss had used a single forged notary stamp across multiple filings. The stamp itself was a copy of a legitimate notary seal close enough to pass a casual inspection, different enough that a careful federal examiner would note the discrepancy. He'd since moved to more sophisticated methods. But the old stamp had touched 14 deeds across 3 counties, including, and this was the piece that gave the Prentice Creek situation its particular elegance, the Ashford filing. Edmund Ashford had purchased the land through legitimate channels. But the notary who'd validated his filing had used without knowing it a stamp that Voss could challenge in court as fraudulent. He hadn't planted the stamp. The notary himself had acquired a copy stamp without realizing its provenance. But Voss knew, and Voss could raise the challenge at any time, and a challenge deed in a Wyoming Territorial court in 1884 could be tied up long enough to become worthless. He didn't want to destroy Miriam Ashford's claim. He wanted to make her afraid enough of losing it that she would sign it over to him for protection. Or better, that she would marry him, in which case the management of her assets would become legally his concern. He brought flowers to the schoolhouse on Friday afternoon. Yellow wildflowers from the hills east of town, tied with a ribbon he'd bought at the general store. Miriam accepted them with polite surprise. They're very pretty, she said. Thank you, Mr. Voss. Harlan, please. He smiled. I was passing by and thought of you. How are the children managing? She showed him the classroom with the ease of a woman accustomed to treating visitors as school board members, which he was. He praised the students' arithmetic work on the blackboard. He asked appropriate questions about curriculum and the upcoming summer break. He was warm, attentive, and interested in exactly the right proportion. When he left, he passed Cole Dantry on the porch steps. The two men looked at each other. Voss nodded pleasantly. "Fine work on the roof," he said. "The board appreciates it." Cole said nothing. His expression was the particular kind of neutral that isn't actually neutral at all. Voss continued to his horse. Behind him, he heard nothing. No door, no footsteps. He had the distinct impression, without turning to confirm it, that Cole Dantry was still standing on the porch watching him ride away. Across the street at the fence line of the Garner property, Cole stood with a fencing nail between his teeth and watched Voss mount and ride. He had been working the Garner fence since Monday, a separate job from the school roof taken on to extend his stay and his income. The fence ran along the main street for 30 yards before cutting back toward the pasture, which meant Cole had an unobstructed view of the schoolhouse porch from his worksite. He had not meant to be watching. He turned back to the fence post and drove the nail. Something was happening in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time, something cautious and wary, and if he was being fully honest with himself, not entirely unpleasant. He didn't examine it closely. A man who spent 5 years in motion learns not to spend too much time examining things that might not survive the next departure. He drove another nail. The schoolhouse door opened again, and Miriam came out to shake the chalk dust from her eraser. She didn't look in his direction. She went back inside. Cole picked up the next fence post. Friday of the second week, Miriam asked Cole if he'd help her move the storage boxes in the back room. The school board was talking about adding a lending library. 3 families had donated books, and she needed to reorganize the storage shelves to make room. Cole came in after the children left. The storage room was small and smelled of chalk and old paper and the particular dusty warmth of a room that holds other people's discarded things. There were boxes of old textbooks, a broken globe, a set of readers from the 60s, and several cardboard boxes that belonged to Miriam. Personally, things she hadn't found a permanent home for. They worked efficiently. Cole moved the heavy boxes. Miriam directed where things went with the decisive competence of someone who has moved her household enough times to have opinions about the process. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. He was lifting the last of the heavy boxes to the upper shelf when the flap fell open and the green ledger slid partway out. He caught it before it fell, set it on the sorting table to let Miriam retrieve it. She picked it up and turned to replace it in the box. The pages were open, had fallen open when the ledger slid, and Cole, without meaning to, was looking at the page. Columns of careful handwriting, a copied document, a deed. He looked at it for 2 seconds, maybe 3. He had seen that notary stamp number before. Not the stamp itself, just the number, the identifying code inscribed around the edge of the seal impression. He had looked at that code often enough in the months after losing the Dantry flats that it had embedded itself in a deep part of his memory the way bad things do. He turned back to the shelf, repositioned a box that didn't need repositioning. "All right," Miriam said behind him. "Yes," Cole said. His voice was level. "I think that's everything." That evening, he walked to his mother's room and sat in the chair beside her bed without turning on the lamp. "Cole," Ruth said from the dark. "Hey, Mama, what happened?" It wasn't a question. She'd always been able to tell. "Nothing yet," he said. He sat there until she fell asleep. Then he went to his own room and lay on top of the covers in his work clothes and stared at the ceiling. He had known in some peripheral part of his mind that Harlan Voss was still in the world and still operating. A man like that doesn't stop. He moves to the next county, the next widow, the next family with land and a gap in their legal knowledge. Cole had thought sometimes about finding a way to bring Voss to account, had thought about it and then put it aside because the thinking was a trap. A man who spends his life planning revenge is not rebuilding anything. But this was different. This was Miriam Ashford's dead husband's deed. This was the same stamp. This was Voss doing to her what he'd done to the Dantrys, except she didn't know yet, and she was sitting 6 doors down the street, having flowers brought to her by a man who intended to take her land. Cole lay there for a long time. He did not sleep. End of part 1. Cole lay awake that first night in the Peck boarding house and looked at the ceiling and thought about the Dantry flats the way he always thought about them in new places, not with longing exactly, but with the particular precision of a man cataloging something lost. The creek that ran along the south pasture, the way the cottonwoods looked in early October when they went gold, the smell of the barn in winter cold air and hay and the warmth of animals. He cataloged it all with the methodical care he brought to everything because he believed in some private and unexpressed way that if he kept the memory exact enough, kept all the details alive and specific, then the thing itself was not entirely gone. He was 34 years old. He had been walking other men's land since he was 29. He was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixed, though that kind was there too. The deeper kind. The kind that accumulates when a man wakes up every morning and does good work and goes to bed, having built nothing of his own. He was a good worker. He knew that about himself without pride, the way a man knows he is left-handed or can carry a tune. He had put up buildings and fences and repaired roofs and mended tack and branded cattle and done 100 other things with the competence of someone who pays close attention. He had done all of it on other men's land. He had nothing to show for it that he could stand on. In the morning he rose before 5, the old habit, and was on his way up the hill to the schoolhouse before the sun was fully up. The air smelled like April cold still, but with the hint of something green underneath. He stood in the schoolyard for a moment and breathed it in. Then he got the ladder out of the lean-to and climbed up and started work. He worked well. He always worked well. It was the one thing that had not worn out. Ruth Dantry had outlived her husband by 12 years and her homestead by 5, and she had opinions about both experiences. She told Cole on his 3rd evening visiting her that she thought losing the land had been worse than losing his father, not because she'd loved the land, more which she hadn't, but because a man dying is an act of God, and a man being cheated is an act of men, and acts of men could have been otherwise. Harold Dantry had died of a fever in January of 1872, quick and simple as a candle going out, and she grieved him fully, and then got up and kept running the flats because there were cattle to feed and a boy to raise, and grief, whatever else it is, doesn't milk cows. The land was different. The land had been taken. "You know what I never told you," she said one evening, looking at the ceiling. "I knew something was wrong with that notary. The day we signed, he was nervous. I thought it was just a young man and his first complicated filing." She turned her head to look at Cole. "I should have said something." "It wouldn't have changed it, Mama." "Maybe not, but I should have said something." She was quiet. "You're like your father in most ways, but you got my tendency to notice things and stay quiet about them." Cole thought about Miriam's record book, about the stamp number he'd recognized and then turned away from. "I'm working on that," he said. Ruth made a sound that might have been a laugh. It turned into a cough. He waited while she settled. "The teacher," Ruth said when she could. "Delia tells me she's a sensible woman. She seems to be. Delia also says Harlan Voss has been paying her attention." Cole was quiet. "You know Voss," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Cole said. She looked at him a long time. "Then you know what that means for her." "Yes." "Cole, I know Mama." She reached out and found his hand in the dim room. Her grip was still strong. "Don't wait too long," she said, "on any of it." He sat with her until she slept, and then he sat a while longer. After that evening in the rain, Cole found himself aware of the piano in a way he hadn't been before. He would hear it sometimes from the schoolyard while he worked on the east edge repairs, faint through the walls carried on the afternoon air. It was not music he recognized. Sometimes something formal and measured. Sometimes something slower, feeling its way. He thought about the fact that Edmund Ashford had played too. About the idea of 2 people in a parlor in the evenings, one at the piano, one listening. He thought about what it would mean to be the person listening. He did not think about it long. A man in his position had no business thinking about such things. He drove another nail and kept his mind where it belonged. But on Friday, when she brought him coffee again, not in the rain this time, just appearing on the porch with a mug and the matter-of-fact kindness that seemed to be the way she did things, he found himself saying, without particular planning, "I'd like to learn the piano if you were serious about offering." She looked at him with some surprise. "I was serious," she said. "Though I should warn you, I'm a strict teacher. I've noticed." She smiled then fully and briefly, the kind of smile that happens before a person can decide whether to allow it. It changed her face entirely, made her look younger and more open and like someone who had in a previous life laughed often. "Lessons start Monday," she said, "after the children go home." He nodded, drank his coffee. The thing in his chest, cautious, wary, tentative, grew half a degree warmer. The 3 women who had mentioned Harlan Voss's eligibility to Miriam were Clara Hewitt, who ran the millinery, Dora Sanger, whose husband owned the feed store, and Reverend Marsh's wife Agatha, who considered it her Christian duty to observe the social landscape of the parish. Miriam had listened to each of them with the patient attention she gave everything, and had privately noted that all three women mentioned Voss's financial stability before they mentioned anything else about him. Clara led with his bank account. Dora mentioned his property holdings. Even Agatha, who presumably cared about spiritual matters, had opened with, "He's very comfortable." Miriam had been raised in a household where money was mentioned only in its absence. Her father being a school teacher, himself a man of bookish principle and approximate solvency. She had not married Edmund for his financial prospects, which had been uncertain at best. She did not think poorly of women who considered practical matters, but she noted the pattern. She also noted, without quite articulating it to herself, that not one of the three women had mentioned whether Harlan Voss was kind. She thought of cold Dantry standing in the rain on her roof because he didn't want the wood to swell overnight. She thought of the coffee. She thought of the way he'd said every day about missing the flats, the plain weight of it not performing just true. She went back to grading arithmetic papers. She was a sensible woman. She knew the difference between a man who was present and a man who was permanent. But she found herself that evening playing the piano for a full hour rather than the usual 30 minutes. Something slow and searching and a little unresolved. Cole did not sleep that night, and in the morning he was up before first light and outside in the schoolyard before anyone in Ridgeback Gulch was awake. He stood at the edge of the rise and looked out at the town below the bank at the north end with its solid brick face and the gilt letters Voss and Associates still readable in the early light. The church, the general store, the boarding house where his mother was sleeping with her rough lungs and her pride and her photograph of land she'd never walk again. He thought about what it would cost to speak. He thought about what it would cost to stay silent. A man could argue he had argued with himself during the long walking years that justice was not his obligation, that he had survived the worst of it, that Voss's other victims were strangers to him, and a man couldn't take on every wrong in the territory, that to pursue Harlan Voss with whatever evidence he might marshal was to volunteer for a fight against the most powerful man in the county, a fight where Cole Dantry's only real asset was 5 years of suppressed knowledge and a wound that had never entirely closed. He could argue all of that. He stood in the early morning light and looked at the bank and then at the schoolhouse and then at the boarding house where his mother slept. The argument didn't hold. He went back inside, sat at the kitchen table in the silent boarding house, and with the stub of a pencil he'd taken from a fence post marking job, he began to write down everything he remembered about the day he'd lost the Dantry flats. The notary, the stamp number, the name of the clerk in Laramie who'd filed the paperwork. Everything in his careful block handwriting on both sides of a sheet of paper Delia Peck used for grocery lists. He did not know yet what he was going to do with the information. He only knew that the time for keeping it in his chest alone was over. The writing lessons were Cole's idea. Technically, the school board had asked Miriam to be able to make home visits to outlying families, and Cole had volunteered when he overheard the conversation at the feed store. Miriam had agreed with the same brisk practicality she applied to everything. There was a need, here was a solution, fine. The piano lessons were hers. She proposed them on a Tuesday 4 days after the rain on the roof evening, in the tone of a woman who has made a decision and is informing rather than asking. You should learn the piano. It's a useful skill. Cole had looked at her for a moment, trying to determine if she was serious. She was always serious. He was coming to understand about things that mattered to her, and she had apparently decided that his musical education mattered. He had agreed, he wasn't sure why. They settled into a rhythm that neither of them named. Tuesdays and Thursdays late afternoon riding lessons in the meadow east of town. Cole took a borrowed horse from the Garner stable, a brown mare named Josephine, who had excellent manners and the wary patience of a horse that had taught beginners before. Miriam arrived in a plain blue riding skirt she'd purchased from the dry goods store on the theory that she was going to do this properly, and Cole met her in the meadow with Josephine already saddled. She was afraid of the horse. She did not say so. He could tell from the precise way she held herself when Josephine turned her head, the slight stiffening, the controlled breathing. He didn't mention it. He showed her instead how to let the horse smell her hand, how to speak low and steady, how to move without sudden gestures, how the horse would follow the calm she projected or reflect the anxiety she tried to hide. You can't deceive a horse, he said on the third lesson. That sounds like a moral observation, Miriam said from Josephine's back. It's a practical one. She knows what you're feeling before you do sometimes. That's unsettling. It gets easier. She's deciding if you're trustworthy is all. Miriam looked down at the horse's neck. How does she decide? Consistency, Cole said. She decides you're trustworthy the same way people do. You show up the same way every time. Miriam was quiet for a moment. Then she clicked her tongue the way he'd shown her, and Josephine moved forward into a walk, and Miriam sat it well, her back straight, her hands quiet, her fear becoming over the next hour something closer to competence. Monday and Wednesday evenings piano lessons in the schoolhouse office. Cole arrived after supper, hat in hand, and sat beside Miriam on the piano bench, with the discomfort of a large man in a small space that was not his natural territory. The bench was narrow. They were inevitably closer than the occasion seemed to call for. The first lesson, Miriam was fully the teacher, brisk, patient, correct. She placed his hands on the keys and demonstrated scales and explained the relationship between the notes in a way that was clear and logical. Cole concentrated hard and managed a simple scale with his right hand and felt simultaneously ridiculous and oddly pleased. By the third lesson, the teacher-student formality had relaxed somewhat. She still corrected him promptly without softening when his fingering was wrong or his timing off. But between corrections, there were gaps of quiet where they sat side by side in the lamplight, and she talked about music the way she talked about things she loved carefully with precision, but with something personal just below the surface. She told him about learning piano at 7 from a neighbor in Philadelphia, about her father's belief that music was a form of thinking, about Edmund's playing, which had been technically imperfect but emotionally genuine, which she had found, she said, more affecting than technical perfection. He played what he meant, she said. You always knew what he meant. She said it without grief, just as a fact about a person she had known. Cole listened. He said eventually, what did he mean most often? She thought about it. Contentment, she said. That was his natural key. Cole nodded. He played the scale again. Better this time. What would yours be, she said, if you played? He was quiet for a while. She waited. She had learned that he thought before he answered, and that the waiting was worth it. Not contentment, he said. Not yet. He touched the keys without pressing them. Something that's reaching for something. She looked at his hands on the keys, large scarred hands pressing very gently on the ivory, as though the notes were fragile. That's called a major seventh, she said quietly. It's a chord that wants to resolve. That always sounds like it's leaning towards somewhere. He looked at her. Teach me that one, he said. She showed him. The federal surveyor rode into Ridgeback Gulch on a Thursday morning in Itmaha, leading a pack mule and tied up at the general store with the unhurried manner of a man who was not in any particular rush and knew exactly what he was doing and where he was going, which is a recognizable posture in a certain kind of federal official. His name was August Keene. He was 47 years old, and he had been building a case against fraudulent land dealings in Wyoming Territory for 2.5 years. He had pattern evidence, a series of voided deeds across 3 counties, all sharing the characteristic of a particular slightly off notary stamp impression, but he had no direct witness. He had interviewed 14 families who had lost land. 12 of them were too frightened to speak on record. 2 others had moved on and couldn't be found. He needed someone who had firsthand knowledge of the transaction, who had been there, who had seen the original filing, who could testify to the stamp's use. He was in Ridgeback Gulch because Harlan Voss was in Ridgeback Gulch, and because a land records clerk in Cheyenne, finally deciding that her conscience outweighed her job security, had sent Keene a letter last February with 3 names on it. Cole Dantry's name was first. Cole recognized Keene's Federal Land Authority notice. He'd seen the posting in a Laramie office 3 months ago and approached him that first evening at the general store with the directness that was his natural mode. You're looking at the stamp cases, Cole said. Keene looked at him. He was a careful, weathered man with the eyes of someone who has spent years sifting truth from accommodation. What makes you say that? You didn't ride into town talking. Federal land surveyors who are doing surveys talk. They ask about property lines and water rights and who owns what parcel. You've been watching the bank. Keene considered him for a moment. Let's walk, he said. They walked to the far end of the main street, past the last building and into the open grass beyond, and talked for 2 hours in the May evening while the light went slowly from gold to gray. Keene laid out what he had, the pattern, the stamp, the scope, 14 affected families spread across Albany, Carbon, and Laramie counties covering nearly 8,000 acres of stolen land, in total representing fraud worth an estimated $40,000 to $60,000 at current land values. Cole listened to all of it. Then he told Keene about the Dantry flats. Not the version he'd told in his head during the walking years, the shortened and armored version, the actual version. October 1879. The filing at the Laramie Territorial Office. The notary who'd been in retrospect too smooth and too quick. The clerk who hadn't asked the right questions. The letter that came 3 weeks later from a territorial court citing an administrative discrepancy with the notary validation which had voided the deed, which had given the underlying claim to the party that had filed the challenge, a silent holding company that turned out on the fourth or fifth layer of tracing to belong to Voss. He told it plainly without drama the way he always told hard things. Keene listened without interrupting. When Cole was done, Keene was quiet for a moment. Then, I need you to testify to that on federal record in Cheyenne. Cole thought about what testifying meant. It meant going on record against the most powerful man in the county, in a territory where Voss had friends and offices Cole couldn't see. It meant his name attached to a public accusation. It meant Voss knowing. It meant whatever Voss did when he knew. Give me a week to think, Cole said. Keene nodded. I'll be doing legitimate survey work in the meantime. No one needs to know what we've discussed. They shook hands. Cole walked back to town. Keene went back to the general store. That night, Cole ate supper with Ruth and told her he'd met someone interesting. And she asked what kind of interesting, and he said the useful kind. And she looked at him for a long moment and said, all right. It was the most she'd said about the situation. It was enough. Ruth's breathing worsened in the second week of May. It wasn't sudden, and nothing with her lungs was sudden. It was always gradual, a slow tide coming in. But this time it was worse than the previous bad spells. She woke coughing at 2 in the morning, and Cole, who slept lightly in the way of men who have spent years in unfamiliar places, heard it through the wall and was in her room with the lamp lit before she'd finished. I'm all right, she said between coughs. I know, Cole said. He sat beside her and waited. A doctor, she said when she could speak. Don't. Mama, I mean it. The money. I'll figure out the money. Cole, I'll figure it out, he said. Not angry, just final. The Cheyenne doctor, the one with a reputation for lung cases who had been recommended by the Peck family's physician, charged $12 for a house call. Cole had $4.20 in the tobacco tin he kept under his mattress. He had $3 coming at the end of the week from the Garner fence job. $7.20. He needed $12. He spent 2 days looking at the problem from different angles. He could borrow, but from whom? He had no friends in Ridgeback Gulch yet, and pride, real pride, resists borrowing from strangers. He could wait and hope Ruth improved on her own, but he'd seen what waiting looked like in 2 of the bad spells, and he didn't like the arithmetic. He sold the horse on a Friday morning. Not Josephine. Josephine was Garner's horse. His horse, a line-back Grulla he'd bought in Colorado 8 months ago. A good horse, a working horse, not a saddle horse, worth $15 to the right buyer. He found the right buyer at the Miller Ranch 3 miles east of town, a young hand who'd been looking for a workhorse and had the money and was glad to deal quickly. Cole walked back to town with $15 in his pocket and his saddle over his shoulder. He paid for the doctor. He kept enough for 1 more week at the boarding house. He had nothing else. He walked 3 miles each way to his work sites for the next 2 weeks. He didn't mention it to anyone. His boots were good enough for the distance, though not comfortably. He ate less than usual and told himself he wasn't hungry and half believed it. The doctor came and examined Ruth and said what Cole had half known, the lungs were damaged and would not improve. But with rest and dry air and careful management, she could have more time, months, possibly more. The main risk was infection. Avoid cold, avoid damp, keep her warm and rested. Cole arranged with Delia Peck to keep a fire going in Ruth's room on cool evenings, added to his tab, and went back to his work sites 3 miles each way on foot. He was on foot on the Tuesday of the 3rd week when Miriam arrived at the schoolhouse on Josephine, sitting straight and sure in the saddle the way she hadn't 3 weeks ago. She dismounted with an ease that pleased him. She'd been practicing on her own. She led Josephine to the fence, tied her off, and went inside. Cole was at the far fence line. He watched her go in. He watched the door. An hour later, he saw her come out of the general store and have a brief conversation with Clara Hewitt, who kept a sharp eye on everything in town, and would have noticed that Cole was walking rather than riding. That evening, there was a covered plate on the boarding house front step. No note. The plate was one of Miriam Ashford's. He recognized it from the schoolhouse kitchen, a particular blue-rimmed pattern. The food was still warm. He stood on the front step for a long moment with the plate in his hands. He went inside and ate, and was for reasons he couldn't entirely explain more, shaken by the plate of food than by any of the other events of the past 2 weeks. Voss came to Miriam on a Thursday in late May with the loan proposal, and he presented it over coffee in a way that was so skillfully framed as an act of generosity that Miriam would later have difficulty articulating exactly where the manipulation had been. He was concerned, he said, about the deed situation. He had looked into it as promised, and there were some complexities he didn't want to alarm her. These things happen in territorial filings that might require legal attention. He knew a territorial attorney in Cheyenne who could help navigate the issue. The fees would not be insignificant. Additionally, and here he paused with practiced delicacy, he was aware that she carried some outstanding debts from her late husband's estate, Philadelphia creditors. He had heard this through the normal channels of town commerce. He did not say how he'd heard it, which was through a letter of inquiry he'd written to Edmund's former business associates under the guise of a routine credit check. He was in a position, if she'd accepted in the spirit intended, to offer a simple arrangement, a loan at a gentleman's rate of interest to cover both the attorney's fees and the outstanding Philadelphia debts. The collateral would be the Prentice Creek deed held in trust by his office, returned to her clear and unchallenged once the legal matter was resolved. He said all of this warmly, generously, as a man offering shelter from a storm. Miriam sat across from him with her coffee cup and her school teacher's face attentive, polite, giving nothing away, and listened to all of it. "That's very kind of you," she said. "I'll think about it." "Of course," Voss said warmly. "No rush." He left. Miriam sat for 10 minutes after he left, quite still looking at the coffee cup. Then she went to find Cole. She found him at the Garner fence, which was where he was most days now. She waited until he'd finished the post he was setting before she spoke. "Voss made me a loan offer," she said, "using the deed as collateral." Cole drove a nail into the fence rail. "Don't sign anything," he said. She blinked. "I didn't say I was going to." "Good." She looked at him. "You have a reason for saying that beyond general caution." He was quiet. "Cole!" He set down the hammer and looked at her directly. She had learned the gesture that meant he was about to say something he'd been working up to. "Voss isn't what he appears," he said. "In my opinion." "That's not a reason. That's an impression." "It's more than that." "Then tell me more than that." He held her gaze. She could see the calculation happening, what to say, how much, why. She waited with the patience she used on students who were afraid to answer. "Not yet," he said. "I'll tell you when I can." She felt the sting of it, the withholding, which felt like distrust, which felt like dismissal. "You have no standing in my financial affairs, Mr. Dantry," she said. Her voice was even, which she was proud of. "No," he said, "I know that." She turned and walked back to the schoolhouse. She was 3 steps away when she heard him behind her quietly, "Miriam." She stopped. He never used her first name. "Just don't sign," he said. "Please." She stood there for a moment with her back to him. "I wasn't going to," she said, and walked away. That evening, she played the piano for a long time. Not the formal pieces. The other kind, the searching, unresolved kind. She played until her hands were tired, and then sat in the quiet with her hands in her lap and admitted to herself that she was angry at Cole Dantry, which was interesting because being angry at someone in that particular way meant he occupied a position of importance in your thoughts that not everyone was permitted. She was not sure when she'd permitted it. She was not sure she'd had very much choice. Cole, meanwhile, wrote a short note to August Keene at his temporary office in the next town over. The note said, "I'll testify." The federal deposition took place on a Tuesday morning in the land office, which was a small room at the back of the post office smelling of paper and dust and the weight of official process. Keene had arranged it quietly, just himself, a federal stenographer who'd come from Cheyenne and Cole. Cole wore his good shirt. He had one. He'd pressed it with the iron Delia Peck kept in the kitchen. He testified for 2 hours. He told the story the way he'd written it, in his block handwriting, on the back of the grocery list paper, chronologically, precisely, without embellishment. The filing, the stamp, the challenge, the loss. He named the notary. He named the date. He provided the stamp code number, which he had never written anywhere, which lived only in the part of his memory that stored bad things permanently and perfectly. Keene asked precise questions. The stenographer wrote. The room was very quiet. When it was done, Cole stepped outside into the May morning and stood in the street for a moment. He felt lighter in a way he hadn't expected, and also more exposed, which was the other side of the same thing. He had carried that testimony for 5 years. Now it was written down in federal ledgers under his name in Cheyenne. It was no longer just his. Word travels at the speed of gossip in a town of 340 people, which is approximately the speed of sound. By noon, Delia Peck knew. By 2 o'clock, 3 ranch families knew. By supper time, the saloon was discussing it, and the tone was mixed, some respect for a man willing to go on record, some wariness about the wisdom of making an enemy of the banker, and some frank curiosity about what would happen next. Harlan Voss learned at 4 o'clock from a friend at the post office who thought he was doing Voss a service by telling him immediately. Voss received the news with perfect stillness. He thanked his friend. He poured himself a glass of water, which he did not drink. He sat at his desk for 20 minutes, looking at nothing visible. Then he began making plans. Miriam heard it from Clara Hewitt at the millinery on her way home from school. Hewitt had the full version by then, including Cole's name and the Dantry land history and the substance of the charges against Voss. She stood in the millinery and listened with her face arranged in the composed attention she used professionally, and inside her chest, something shifted, the kind of shift that happens when a thing you suspected turns out to be confirmed, and the confirmation is both validating and terrible. She did not go to Cole that evening. She went home and played the piano for 2 hours. Beethoven, for once, the formal, structured kind where everything stays in its place and the resolution is inevitable and earned. She played until the piece was finished, and then she sat in the dark and quiet for a long time. She was thinking about a man who had sat next to her on a narrow piano bench for 6 weeks and had known what he knew and had not said it, not because he was withholding from her, she now understood, but because he was trying to protect her from something he hadn't yet figured out how to fix. And he was a man, she understood with clarity, who did not ask for help with things he hadn't figured out yet. She thought about that. She thought about a covered plate on a boarding house step. She thought about "not yet, I'll tell you when I can." The piano sat in the dark beside her. She put her hand on the keys without pressing them and thought about a chord that wants to resolve. That always sounds like it's leaning towards somewhere. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. Harlan Voss moved within 48 hours of learning about the deposition. He was careful about it. He did not approach Hatch directly because Clem Hatch was a man of limited imagination, but genuine principle and a direct instruction would have produced resistance. Instead, Voss mentioned casually, conversationally, in the way of a man sharing a concern to 2 ranchers he knew were friendly with the deputy, that there had been a report of cattle missing from the Carver South pasture. He mentioned that someone had reportedly seen a man on foot near the south fence line on Saturday night. He described the man in terms that matched Cole Dantry. He expressed with appropriate sorrow his hope that the matter would be looked into. It was enough. Hatch came to Cole on Friday morning, apologetic, clearly uncomfortable with the formal necessity of a man doing his job while not being certain his job was entirely right. "I have to ask you some questions," he said, "about Saturday night." Cole answered the questions. He had been at the boarding house Saturday night visiting Ruth, then in his own room. He had seen no one who could confirm the boarding house part except Ruth, who was ill, and Delia Peck, who'd been in her back room all evening and hadn't noted his comings and goings. "I'm going to have to ask you to stay in town," Hatch said. He looked pained. "Just until I can confirm some things. I'm sorry, Dantry." Cole looked at him. "You know this is Voss," he said. Hatch said nothing. "You know what I testified to," Cole said. "I know what people are saying you testified to," Hatch said carefully. "I don't know the facts yet. That's what I'm trying to establish." He paused. "Stay in town. I'll get this sorted." That night, Hatch found himself with a formal complaint from the Carver Ranch. The cattle, it turned out, had simply wandered through a gap in the fence to a neighboring pasture. They were recovered the next morning, and the uncomfortable awareness that he had just done Harlan Voss's bidding without meaning to. He sat in his office with his feet on his desk and thought about what kind of man he intended to be. It was the first time in 10 years of wearing the badge that he'd asked himself that question with any urgency. Cole spent Friday night in a town that had become overnight slightly colder. Men who had nodded at him on the street found other directions to look. The Garner family canceled his fence contract politely, with excuses about their budget. The feed store declined to extend him credit for a bag of nails he needed. He ate supper with Ruth and did not tell her any of it. She looked at his face and said, "Tell me." He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the precision of a woman who had lost land and husband and health and still had her judgment intact, "He's afraid of you, Cole. A man who's afraid makes noise. Noise can be used." "How do you mean?" "He's showing everyone what he is," she said. "People who've been willing to look away from a banker's quiet sins have a harder time looking away from a bully's loud ones." Cole thought about Deputy Hatch's pained expression. "Maybe," he said. "Not maybe," Ruth said. She reached for his hand. You hold your ground. You've been doing that for 5 years already. What's a little longer?" He held her hand. Outside, the Wyoming night was clear and cold, and the stars were the particular hard brilliance of high-altitude darkness. And somewhere across town, Miriam Ashford was playing the piano in the lamplight of her schoolhouse office and thinking about what she was going to do next. The writing lessons had a specific geography. They started at the mounting block where Josephine stood with her wide brown patience while Miriam arranged herself in the saddle with a precision that was technically correct and emotionally approximate. They moved to the meadow where the grass was long enough to muffle hoofbeats and the town was not visible, which Cole had found from experience helped people who were nervous in the saddle. And they finished back at the fence where Miriam dismounted and spent a moment with Josephine's neck, in the particular way of people who are beginning to fall in love with horses, not showy, not dramatic, just quiet and specific. Cole watched this happen and thought about trust, about how it builds slowly through the accumulation of consistent behavior through the horse learning that the same hands will always be there, always the same, through the rider learning that the horse will carry her if she lets it. On the fourth lesson, Josephine broke into a trot without being asked, spooked by a jackrabbit in the grass, and Miriam stayed on. She pulled the horse back to a walk, and when they'd settled, she sat for a moment in the saddle with her eyes closed and then looked at Cole with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, pure, uncomplicated triumph. "I stayed on," she said. "You did," he said. She laughed. The short, surprise laugh, the one that happened before she could decide about it. She pressed it away quickly with the back of her hand, which didn't help at all. Cole looked at the grass. He was smiling. He kept that to himself mostly. That evening at the piano, she was relaxed in a way she hadn't been in the earlier lessons. She corrected his fingering less and let him find the notes more. And when he finally got the major seventh chord, the leaning one, the one that wants to resolve, right 3 times in a row, she said, "There. Now you have something." "What do I have?" "A chord that sounds like where you're headed," she said, "not where you've been." He looked at the keys. "I'll take that," he said. They were quiet for a while. The lamp burned. Outside, the Wyoming evening was turning deep blue. "Cole," she said. "Yes." "Why are you still here in Ridgeback, I mean? The school roof has been done for 3 weeks. He thought about that. He thought about the honest answer and the cautious answer and the difference between them. "There are things here that need finishing," he said. She looked at the piano keys. "Yes," she said, "there are." They did not look at each other. The cords sat between them, leaning towards somewhere, waiting. Cole had not expected the plate of food to affect him as much as it did. He sat at the kitchen table in the boarding house after eating and held the empty plate in his hands, the blue-rimmed plate he recognized from the schoolhouse kitchen, and tried to identify what exactly was happening in his chest. It was something he did not usually allow himself to identify. Being a man who had learned that certain kinds of wanting, when examined too closely, made the absence of the thing wanted more acute. But he sat with it. She had noticed that was the first thing. She had noticed he was on foot and had traced it back to the horse and had understood what it meant without needing to be told. She had not asked him about it. She had not offered money, which would have been mortifying. She had not said anything at all. She had just left food warm on the step in a way that could be interpreted as neighborliness and nothing more. It was, he recognized, an act of complete tact, of someone who understood his pride and worked around it rather than against it. He had not had someone do that for him in a long time. He washed the plate carefully and dried it and set it aside to return. He sat in the kitchen for a while longer in the quiet house. Delia Peck was in bed. Ruth was asleep. The night was very still. He thought this is what it could look like, a person who notices, a person who doesn't need to make it large. Then he stopped thinking about it because a man who has nothing to offer has no business constructing pictures of what he might offer it to. He went to bed. He slept better than he had in weeks. Cole wrote the note to Keene on a Wednesday evening, 2 days after his conversation with Miriam at the fence line. He wrote it at the kitchen table in the boarding house with Delia Peck's pencil, and it was 5 words, "I'll testify." When and where. He folded it and addressed it to Keene's temporary office in the next town and gave it to the post office the next morning. Then he walked 3 miles to the Miller Ranch and 3 miles back and worked a full day and was tired in the particular good way of physical labor that has an honest product. And on the walk back, he thought about what testifying would mean. It would mean the story being out. All of it, his name, the Dantry flats, the loss, 5 years of walking. Things he had told no one entirely except Keene. Things he had told Miriam in pieces, the loss, not the cause. She would learn it all once he testified. That was inevitable in a town this size. He wasn't sure when he examined it if that was a reason for or against. He thought about her on the fence line, her voice level, controlled, properly annoyed. You have no standing in my financial affairs, Mr. Dantry. Technically and entirely true. He had nothing to offer her standing. He had a saddle, a tobacco tin with $4, and a claim on a piece of land that was in federal review. That was the inventory. He thought about the way she'd stopped when he said her name. He walked the last mile in the evening light with the saddle over his shoulder, and the weight of what he was about to do settled across the back of his neck like something he'd been carrying for a long time that was finally facing the right direction. Deputy Clem Hatch sat in his office the morning after the deposition and listened to the town wake up. He had been a lawman in Ridgeback Gulch for 10 years. He had handled drunks' property disputes, a stabbing in the saloon, 3 livestock thefts, 2 domestic matters he'd rather not remember, and the time the Kellerman boy had accidentally set fire to his father's grain store. He had handled all of these things with the tools available to him, the law as he understood it, the community relationships he'd built in his own judgment, which he considered fair if not brilliant. He had for 10 years understood that Harlan Voss was the most important man in the county and acted accordingly. Not corruptly, he'd never taken money or done anything outside the law. But he'd been considerate of Voss's position, of the way Voss's opinion shaped the town council's opinion, which shaped the school board's opinion, which shaped in aggregate most of what happened in Ridgeback Gulch. He sat in his office and thought about Cole Dantry standing across from him saying, No, this is Voss. He thought about the inventory of what he actually knew versus what he'd been willing to look at. He thought about 14 families across 3 counties. He thought about a man who had walked in here on foot with a saddle because he'd sold his horse to pay for his mother's doctor and who had given sworn federal testimony against the most powerful man in the county and who was now looking at a cattle theft charge that Hatch knew in his honest bones was manufactured. Hatch was not a brave man by nature. He was a consistent man. He did what he said he'd do. He kept his word. The question of what kind of man he intended to be, which he'd asked himself the night before for the first time in a decade, sat in his chest like a stone all morning. August Keene had interviewed a great many people in 2.5 years of building this case. He had learned to distinguish between the testimony of someone who was telling him what they thought he wanted to hear, someone who was telling him a story they'd rehearsed, and someone who was telling him the truth. Cole Dantry was telling him the truth. It was apparent not in any dramatic way. No breaks in the voice, no theatrical moments, but in the specificity. Real memory has texture. Real memory includes the things you didn't mean to notice at the time, the nervous notary's habit of clearing his throat, the particular smell of the Wyoming Territorial office on a cold October morning, the sound the door made when the clerk came back with the wrong stamp. Cole's account had all of that. It had the uneven surface of something actually lived. Keene walked back to the general store in the May evening and thought about what he had and what he still needed. He had a witness. He had pattern evidence. He had a stamp code. He had 14 families' losses documented. He did not yet have the physical evidence that would tie the forgery directly to Voss, the original stamp device correspondence, a record of the scheme. He had enough to open a formal investigation and file an injunction. He was close to enough to get a conviction. He went to bed in this room he'd taken at the Miller Ranch and thought carefully about what happened next. He was aware as a federal investigator of significant experience that once a target knew he was being actively investigated, the target became unpredictable. Some men folded, some men ran, some men fought. He thought about Harlan Voss, who was a deacon, who had built his empire over 18 years, who had friends in territorial government and probably in the federal land office. He thought Voss will fight. He blew out the lamp and in the dark revised his timeline. He needed to move faster than he'd planned. Miriam came to the jail on Saturday morning. Cole heard her before he saw her, the particular sound of her footsteps, which he had learned over 6 weeks distinct from anyone else's in Ridgeback Gulch, a firm and unhurried step that announced her presence without announcing her intention. He was sitting on the edge of the jail cot, which was not comfortable, but was not the worst surface he'd slept on, looking at the morning light coming through the single window. She appeared at the cell door. Her face was composed in the way of someone who has decided what they are going to say and intends to say it clearly. "I want the truth," she said. "All of it." Cole looked at her. He was aware of his rumpled shirt, the night's growth of beard, the particular disadvantage of being behind bars when a woman you respect is standing free and wanting answers. He was also aware that this was in some essential way the moment he'd been avoiding since he'd seen the stamp number in her record book. "Sit down," he said. There was no chair. She stood at the cell door with her hands around one of the bars, which was an oddly familiar gesture, the same way she held the fence rail, while watching him work the same grip she used on the piano keys in the first lessons. He had the sudden clear thought that she was a person who held things steady when she was uncertain. "Voss took my family's land," he said. 5 years ago, the same notary stamp that's in your record book, the number I saw that day when we were moving boxes, that stamp was the mechanism. He used a forged copy of a legitimate notary seal to void our deed on a procedural challenge. The challenge was his own creation. By the time it worked through the territorial court, the land had been transferred to a holding company that belonged to him." Miriam was very still. "I didn't know who he was when I came to Ridgeback," Cole continued. "I knew the name Voss. I traced it eventually, but I didn't know he was here until the morning you told me about flowers from the hills east of town, and I went to see who was bringing them." He paused. "I recognized him, and I recognized the position you were in." "What position?" "The same one my family was in. A legitimate deed with a compromise stamp that he could use to threaten you, and a man with charm and resources standing nearby offering to protect you from a problem he created." Miriam's grip on the bar tightened slightly. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because telling you meant either warning you off Voss, which without evidence would look like jealousy, which you'd correctly dismiss, or telling you the whole story, which meant telling you about the land and about Keene and about a federal case that wasn't mine to discuss." He looked at her steadily. "And because I wasn't ready." "Wasn't ready?" she repeated. "It's the only honest answer I have. The story, the losing of it, all of it, I've told it once in my life. And that was to a federal surveyor under legal necessity. I hadn't told anyone before that. Not in 5 years." He paused. "I didn't know how to start with you, and I couldn't start in the middle." She was quiet for a long time. The jail was very still. Outside, they could hear the Saturday morning sounds of a small town, horses, someone's dog, the distant clang of the smith's hammer. "You sold your horse," Miriam said. "Yes." "For your mother." "Yes." "And then you walked 3 miles each way for 2 weeks and didn't say anything to anyone." There wasn't anything to say. It needed doing. She looked at him. Her expression had changed. The composed, interrogating look had softened into something more complicated. He couldn't read it entirely. She had a face he'd learned that showed more than she intended to show, only in unguarded moments, and she allowed very few unguarded moments. "You have a habit," she said, "of carrying things alone." "I've had practice." "It's not a virtue, Cole." "I know that." She stood there for another moment. Then she did something he hadn't expected. She reached through the bars and put her hand briefly on his one firm touch, the way you might steady a person who was tilting, and then withdrew it. "I'll speak to Hatch," she said. "You don't have to." "Clem Hatch was in my classroom for 3 years," she said. "I know what he's made of. I'll speak to him." She picked up her reticule from the floor where she'd set it. "Is there anything you need?" He thought about that. "No," he said. "I'm fine." She looked at him in the particular way she had, the gray-eyed, complete inventory look. "All right," she said, and she left. Cole sat on the edge of the cot. He put his hand, the one she'd touched, palm down on his knee, and held it there. He sat like that for a while. She did go to Hatch, but she went to Keene first. She rode Josephine to the Miller Ranch. Her 4th solo ride, the longest she'd done, 3 miles of open road in the early afternoon with the horse steady beneath her, in Wyoming spreading in every direction, enormous and indifferent and magnificent. She had been afraid of this country when she arrived. She was less afraid now. Keene's temporary office was in the Miller Ranch's front room, which the Miller family had rented to him for the duration of his survey work. He looked up from his papers when she came in and assessed her with the quick, careful look he had, not unkind, just accurate. "Mrs. Ashford," he said. "Mr. Keene." She sat down across from him without being asked. "I have something to show you." She opened her record book on his desk. She had carried the record book for the 3-mile ride in her saddlebag wrapped in oilcloth against the weather, which was how she transported all documents of importance. She turned to the pages she'd copied months ago, the Prentice Creek deed, the notary information, the stamp code, and slid the book across to Keene. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. "When did you copy this?" he said. "April," she said. "The first week I found the deed. Before any of this, before Voss approached me, before Cole testified, before any of it. It's my habit with important documents. You didn't know its significance. I knew it was my husband's property documentation. That was sufficient." She folded her hands on the table. I understand the physical documents were stolen from your saddlebags. Yes. These are my own notations made independently and prior to any contact with your investigation. They're in my handwriting in a ledger that has been in continuous use for 6 years, which can be verified by the date continuity of the surrounding entries. She paused. Are they useful to you? Keene looked at her across the table. She could see him thinking the careful, calibrating thought of a man fitting a new piece into an existing structure, checking where it bore weight. Mrs. Ashford, he said, do you understand what this is? I'm a school teacher, Mr. Keene, she said. I understand documents. He looked at the ledger again. He ran a finger along the column of her handwriting without touching the page. Then he sat back. Yes, he said, it's useful. Good. She stood. What happens to the Prentice Creek claim once Voss's scheme is exposed? The fraudulent stampit issue becomes moot, Keene said. If the stamp is established as part of a systematic forgery applied to multiple legitimate deeds, then the stamp's presence on a legitimate deed cannot be used as a challenge to that deed's validity. Your husband's purchase was genuine. Your claim holds. She nodded. And the Dantry land? Keene looked at her. That's under federal review once we move forward. If the scheme is proven, all affected, deeds are reviewed for restoration. Miriam picked up her record book and put it back in her saddlebag. I'll need the record book back, she said. It's the original. We'll make copies and return it within the week, Keene said. She nodded and went back to Josephine and rode the 3 miles back to Ridgeback Gulch. She rode well, better than she'd expected to. She sat in the saddle on the open road with Wyoming around her and thought about a man who'd given his word to a federal surveyor and then walked 3 miles each way to work for 2 weeks in worn-down boots and had not said a single word about any of it, and she thought about what kind of man that was, and she already knew. The federal marshals arrived on a Wednesday. There were 2 of them riding in from Cheyenne with the directness of men who have their paperwork in order and their purpose clear. They tied up at the bank at 10 in the morning and presented Keene's federal injunction at the front desk, and the clerk at the front desk went pale and ran to get Mr. Voss, and Voss came out of his office looking composed and silver-haired and completely in control the way he always looked. He looked at the injunction. He looked at Keene, who had ridden in with the marshals. He looked at the 2 names on the supporting evidence Cole Dantry witness. Miriam Ashford, documentary corroborant. His composure held for a long moment. Then it cracked, not loudly, not dramatically. It cracked the way ice cracks in spring, a sound, and then the thing beneath visible. He looked at Miriam, who was standing near the land office door, because she had a right to be there, because this involved her land, because she had decided she was going to see it. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has badly miscalculated. Not quite anger, something more specific, the recognition of an error that cannot be corrected. Mrs. Ashford, he said, his voice was still controlled, I thought you were a sensible woman. I am, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the marshals, and whatever was going to happen next happened with the law, not with him. Clem Hatch appeared in the doorway of the land office in the middle of all this. He had been standing there for several minutes watching. His face had the look of a man doing a reckoning, counting up what he'd been and what he intended to be. When the marshal asked for local law enforcement to formally process the arrest, Hatch stepped forward. I'll do it, he said. He crossed the room and stood in front of Voss, who was 2 inches taller and 40 pounds heavier, and the most powerful man in the county, and said, Harlan Voss, I'm placing you under arrest on federal fraud charges. His voice was steady. His hands were steady. Voss said nothing. The town of Ridgeback Gulch watched through the land office windows, which were crowded with faces. The story would be told and retold for decades, how Hatch had stood up, how Miriam Ashford had been the one to break the case, how the banker who was a deacon had turned out to be the man who'd taken the Dantry land. Cole was not at the land office. He was at the Peck boarding house sitting with Ruth, who was having a good day, a real good day, the kind where she sat up and ate well and held a conversation without coughing. He'd told her that morning what was happening. She'd listened to all of it. When Delia Peck came to the doorway at 10:30 to tell him it was done, Cole looked at her for a moment. All of it, he said. Arrested, Delia said. Come. Both marshals, Hatch, the whole business. It's over. He nodded. He looked at Ruth. Ruth Dantry, who had lost her husband and her land and her health, and who had outlasted all of it on stubbornness and love, reached over and put her hand on top of her son's and said nothing. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that while outside the town of Ridgeback Gulch made the particular noise a small community makes when something enormous has shifted. 2 days after the arrest, Tuesday evening. The school was done for the day. Children released at 4. The schoolyard, quiet the long Wyoming summer evening, stretching out gold and endless to the west. Miriam was at the blackboard erasing the day's work arithmetic problems and a passage from the reader in the schedule for the following day's lessons. She heard the step on the porch. She knew it. She had learned it. She did not turn around. Cole stood in the doorway. He had his hat in his hands. He had shaved. He was wearing the good shirt which she recognized. He stood there and looked at her back while she erased the board. "I heard about the land review," she said. The chalk eraser moved over the blackboard. "That's good, Cole." "Yes," he said. She finished erasing. She set the eraser on the ledge. She stood facing the blank board for a moment. "Are you going to go back?" she said, "to the flats." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not where I'd go," he said. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and the Wyoming evening behind him, gold and enormous, and going slowly to blue. He looked the way he always looked, steady, quiet, the kind of face that didn't perform what it felt, but didn't hide it either, if you knew where to look. "I'd like to stay," he said. "In Ridgeback, if there's a reason to." She looked at him. The gray eyes, the ones that assessed and measured, and had, over the course of 6 weeks, been doing something else as well, something she'd been pretending not to notice, were very clear. "That's a careful way to put it," she said. "I'm a careful man. I've noticed." She crossed the room, stopped in front of him close enough to see the gray at his temples, the particular quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a man who had nothing to say, but of a man who was saying everything he had, in the only way he knew. "What exactly is the reason you're looking for?" He looked at her. His hat was still in his hands. He didn't move. "You," he said, simply, without drama, a fact. She reached out and took the hat from his hands and set it on the desk beside her. His hands, free now, stayed where they were. She looked at him. "All right," she said. The last of the evening light came through the western windows and lay across the schoolhouse floor in long gold bars, and outside the Wyoming summer was settling into the particular quiet of a place that has been itself for a long time and will continue to be. He raised his hand slowly, carefully, and she turned her face into it. Neither of them said anything else. Neither of them needed to. The weeks after the arrest had their own shape. The federal case moved forward with the efficiency of a process that had been carefully built. Keen's evidence, Cole's testimony, Miriam's record book, and eventually the testimony of 2 other affected families who'd been waiting to see if anyone brave enough to go first would survive it. They had. Other people came forward. The shape of what Voss had done across 3 counties emerged in full, which was worse than anyone had fully understood and better understood than anyone had been willing to say. Clem Hatch was not charged with anything. Keen's report noted that the deputy had cooperated fully once the federal investigation was underway and had demonstrated moral courage at a critical moment. The town council in their next meeting voted Hatch a $20 raise in recognition of his service. He accepted it and went on doing his job, which he now did with more attention to the difference between law and accommodation. Miriam's Prentice Creek deed was confirmed. 640 acres of bottomland along the creek, best water rights in the county, legally and unambiguously hers. She considered what to do with it for approximately 2 weeks, during which time Cole rebuilt the Garner fence line, repaired 3 more structures around town that needed work, and did not mention the land. Then she proposed, this was on a Tuesday, which was a lesson day, though they'd been conducting the lessons differently lately, more playing and less instruction, side by side on the narrow bench, working through pieces together, that he take the south parcel on a fair market lease. She had used the word lease very deliberately. She had set a number that was real but manageable. Cole refused. She argued, he argued back. They argued in the particular way of people who have learned each other's reasoning style and know exactly where the pressure points are. She pointed out that the land was sitting idle. He pointed out that he had a federal land review in process and would have his own parcel within the year. She pointed out that within the year was not now. He pointed out that leasing her land was not the same as building something of his own. "It's a beginning," she said. "It's a shortcut," he said. "There's nothing wrong with a beginning that uses what's available. There is when it means I'm still standing on your land and not mine." She looked at him. "That's your pride talking." "Yes," he said. "It is." A pause. "I'm allowed some." She stared at him. He stared back. She said, "You are the most aggravating man I have ever known." He said, "You've met Harlan Voss." She laughed. It happened before she could decide about it. The real laugh surprised out of her, the one that changed her face entirely. It went on a moment longer than the previous real laughs, and it had something underneath it that was the other side of all the months of tension and difficulty and fear and the accumulation of small and enormous things. Cole looked at her laughing and felt something in his chest that was so different from what he'd carried there for the past 5 years that it took him a moment to identify it. He thought this is what I've been working toward. Not the land, not the vindication, not the testimony and the exposure of Voss. All of those things mattered. But this, a woman laughing in a schoolhouse on a Wyoming summer evening because she was genuinely surprised by something he'd said, this was the thing that had a future in it. They reached an agreement eventually, as reasonable people do, though it was not the one Miriam had proposed. Cole would take nothing from the Prentice Creek parcel until his own land review was settled. When it was settled, they would discuss what the two properties might do together as neighbors, as partners, as what they were becoming, which neither of them had yet put a name to out loud, but which was becoming difficult to miss. Ruth told the basic outline of the arrangement by Cole that evening, said about time. Autumn 1884. The land review came through in September. Cole Dantry received title to 320 acres of the original Dantry flats, the eastern half, the half that Voss hadn't already sold to a third party in 1880, which was legitimately beyond the scope of the restoration order. It was not the whole of what had been taken. It was more than enough. The homestead house was a ruin, 5 years of Wyoming weather, and no maintenance had done the expected work, but the bones of the building were sound, which Cole established in 2 days of careful inspection. He estimated 8 weeks of work to make it habitable. He had the skills and the time, and for the first time in 5 years, a reason to move towards something rather than away from everything. He rode out to the flats the morning after the title came through. Alone on a horse he'd bought the previous week with the last of his repair money. Not the Grulla, which was gone, but a solid bay mare he thought well of. He rode the perimeter of the 320 acres in the September morning. The grass was long and dry, going gold. The creek that ran along the south boundary was running well. Late summer rain had kept it up. The cottonwoods along the bank were beginning the process he'd missed for 5 years. He stopped at the place where the old house had stood and sat on the horse for a while. The wind came across the grass. The cottonwoods moved. He could smell the creek. He had not cried when he lost the land. He did not cry now that he had part of it back. He sat on his horse and breathed the air of his own land and was for a long time simply quiet. Then he turned the horse toward Ridgeback Gulch and rode. Sunday dinners at Miriam's house became the rhythm of the weeks. They had happened first by accident. Cole had stopped by after Sunday service one week in August, when Ruth was having a difficult day and Miriam had been cooking, and the stopping by had naturally become staying, and the staying had naturally become eating, and the eating had naturally become regular. Ruth attended most Sundays installed in the most comfortable chair in Miriam's parlor, with a blanket and opinions about everything which she delivered freely and from which Miriam was not exempt. "You need curtains in the east room," Ruth told Miriam one Sunday in October. "The morning light comes in hard." "I'm aware of the morning light," Miriam said. "I'm just saying, when it's your house, you'd want curtains." Cole at the kitchen's doorway said nothing. He had learned that some conversations proceeded more efficiently without his input. Miriam looked at Ruth with the particular expression she had for statements that required unpacking. "This is my house," she said. "At the moment," Ruth said placidly. Cole went back to the kitchen. He had the distinct impression that his mother and Miriam Ashford were in their fundamental natures very similar people, and that this was either the best possible thing or a thing that required careful navigation. Probably both. After dinner, they sat on the porch. The autumn air was cold enough to require coats, but the sky was clear, and the stars were beginning to show against the deep blue of the late afternoon. Ruth was inside by the fire. Cole and Miriam sat in the two porch chairs that had appeared on Miriam's porch sometime in August, without either of them specifically purchasing them, which was one of many things that had accumulated without explicit discussion. "The house will be ready in December," Cole said. He meant the Flats homestead. "That's fast work. I had help." The Garner family had sent 2 hands for a week. Hatch had come on a Saturday. Even Keene, before he'd returned to Cheyenne, had spent a day helping clear the site. People were generous. Miriam was quiet. She was looking at the evening sky, which had the spectacular quality that Wyoming skies had in autumn, vast and complicated, the kind of sky that made a person feel small, in the good way, the way that says the world is larger than your troubles. "Will you be glad," she said, "to have your own place again?" He thought about that. Yes, he said,
And what?
he looked at her. She was still watching the sky profile auburn hair, the particular quality of her attention, which was always fully present, never approximate. And this is also somewhere I want to be, he said. She turned to look at him. The gray eyes in the evening light were something he thought he could look at for a very long time without wanting to stop. The flats is 14 miles, she said. A good horse can do 14 miles in 2 hours. Not in winter. In most winters, he said, and there are other arrangements that don't require 14 miles. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said it yet. They were both careful people who had learned that careful had a cost, and they were both for once content to let the thing exist in the space between them without requiring a name. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the beginning of something that was going to take a long time to build and was going to hold. She put her hand in his. He held it. The stars came out over Wyoming one by one, the way they always had the creek and the cottonwoods, and the land and the particular vast quiet of a place that keeps its own time indifferent and generous. The land was his again, and for the first time in a long time, so was everything else. He had been in the cell for 18 hours when she came. In that time, he had done several things, slept 4 hours, which surprised him, eaten the food Delia Peck had sent over, which was adequate, and thought with the focused attention that jail provides about the sequence of events that had led here and the sequence that was likely to follow. Voss had moved quickly, which meant Voss was frightened. A man who moves this fast is operating on fear not strategy. That was useful information. Keene was aware of the situation. Cole had managed to get a message to him through the Peck family, and was by Cole's estimate already adjusting his approach. Keene was a methodical man. Being methodical under pressure was different from being slow. It meant he was moving through the correct steps in the correct order, which would produce a correct result. The cattle theft charge would not hold. Cole had no history of theft, no opportunity that anyone could establish, and Hatch was not a man who prosecuted what he didn't believe. The charge was a delay tactic, not an endgame. All of that was manageable. What Cole had not expected, sitting in the cell in the gray morning, was the particular quality of the 18 hours without distraction, without work, without Ruth, without the daily small businesses of staying alive in a new place. Just the cell and the light and his own thoughts. He thought with unusual permission about Miriam. He thought about 6 weeks of Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in a meadow east of town, about evenings on a narrow piano bench, her shoulder 4 inches from his, her hands moving over the keys with the ease of long practice. His own hands, large scarred, more accustomed to hammer and rope than to ivory, learning something new. About coffee in the rain, about a covered plate on a boarding house step, about "I'll speak to Hatch," said in the tone of someone who has made a decision and will not be talked out of it. He thought about her hand on his through the bars, one firm touch. He thought, I am going to have to do something about this. Not yet. There were too many things in motion, and he had nothing to offer yet. No land, no house, no settled future. A man didn't speak from a jail cell about what he wanted his life to look like. He had some self-respect remaining. But when this was over, when there was ground under his boots, that was his own. He held that thought. The town of Ridgeback Gulch saw the arrest happen in the particular way a small community sees things, partially in fragments, assembled afterward into a complete picture through the collaborative work of conversation and memory. The milliner, Clara Hewitt, saw the marshals arrive and went immediately to her door. Dora Sanger's husband at the feed store across the street counted the horses and noted the federal saddle markings. Reverend Marsh's wife, Agatha, was at the dry goods store next to the land office and heard voices through the wall, though not the words. Hatch's deputy, a young man named Potter, who had been in the job 3 months, stood outside the bank with the expression of someone watching history being made and not entirely sure what his role in it was. Each of these people told other people within an hour. The story assembled itself across Ridgeback Gulch with the particular speed of news that people have been half expecting, the way a story confirms what people suspected but hadn't let themselves believe. 14 families, 3 counties, the notary stamp, the holding company, the systematic nature of it, not opportunistic crime, but planned, repeated, institutional. By noon, the saloon had the basic facts. By 2 o'clock, the general store had details. By supper time, the boarding house dinner table had the complete picture, as assembled by Delia Peck from 7 separate sources, which she delivered with the editorial control of a woman who was angry about what had happened in her county and intended to say so. 14 families, she said. 14, and he was a deacon. Ruth Dantry at the table for the first time in a week. It was a good day, a real good day, and Cole had helped her down the stairs, said, "The deacon part is the least surprising thing about it." Delia looked at her. "Respectable people commit crimes," Ruth said. "That's not news. What's news is that someone made it count." She looked at Cole. Cole drank his coffee. "Don't be modest," Ruth said. "It's unbecoming." He almost smiled. There was a word for what they were becoming, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said it on that Tuesday evening in the schoolhouse doorway. This was deliberate, not evasion. They were not evasive people, either of them, but the particular deliberateness of two people who have learned that some things require time to become solid before they can be named. A name makes a thing permanent. Permanence requires a foundation. They were still building the foundation. But there were other ways of saying it, his hand cupped against her face in the last of the Tuesday evening light. Her not stepping back. The quietness that followed, not empty quiet, not awkward quiet, but the full quiet of people who have arrived together at a place they didn't plan. After a while, she stepped back. Not away, but to a different distance, the distance of two people who are going to talk about practical things now, because practical things are how they manage the larger ones. "The trial," she said. "Will you have to testify again?" "Probably." "In Cheyenne?" "Yes." She nodded. "I'll need to give a deposition as well." Keene mentioned it. She looked at her record book still on the desk. "I don't mind, it's the right thing." "Yes," Cole said. She looked at him. "You've been saying that a long time," she said, "that it was the right thing, even when it cost you. Knowing what's right and doing it are the same act. If you separate them, you end up with an opinion instead of a principle." She was quiet for a moment. "Who told you that?" "My mother." She smiled, the small, real smile, the one that reached her eyes. "I like your mother very much." "She likes you," Cole said. "She told me so." "Ruth doesn't tell you she likes you unless she actually does." "No," Miriam agreed. "She doesn't." They stood in the schoolhouse in the evening quiet. Through the windows, the first stars were beginning. "Will you come to dinner Sunday?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Bring Ruth. It's warmer in the parlor than at the boarding house. She'll have opinions." "She always has opinions. I've come to rely on them." He picked up his hat from the desk, stood with it in his hands for a moment. Then he put it on. "Good night, Miriam," he said. "Good night, Cole," she said. He walked down the hill toward the boarding house in the dark. Behind him, the schoolhouse lights stayed on for a while and then went out. And the town of Ridgeback Gulch settled into its evening quiet, unchanged on the surface and changed entirely underneath. She rode back to Ridgeback Gulch in the early afternoon with the record book in her saddlebag and Josephine steady beneath her in the Wyoming sky enormous overhead. She had not expected to feel this particular feeling after leaving Keene's office, a lightness that was not relief exactly, or not only relief, but something more like the sensation of having done the correct thing, which is different from doing the easy thing and different again from doing the impressive thing. It was quieter than either. It was simply the feeling of a thing fitting where it was supposed to go. She had been a teacher for 16 years. In that time, she had taught children who were bright and children who were slow and children who were angry and children who were afraid and children who had learned somewhere before they reached her classroom that the world was not reliable. She had found across all of those years that the most important lesson she had to offer was not arithmetic or reading or even the great literature she loved. It was, your judgment is worth something. When you see something wrong, trust that you see it. When you have evidence, use it. She had copied the deed in April because that was what she did with important documents. She had not known then what the stamp number meant. She had not needed to know. She had simply done the correct small thing, recorded what was there accurately in her own hand in a ledger that was a record of her life and work. The small correct thing had turned out to matter enormously. She thought about that on the ride home. She thought about small correct things in general, about showing up consistently, about leaving a plate of food on a step without a note, about saying I'll speak to Hatch when you could see what needed doing, about copying a deed into a green record book because that was your system and your system was sound. Big moments, she had come to believe, are almost always the accumulation of small correct choices made over a long time by people who were paying attention. She arrived in Ridgeback Gulch, tied Josephine at the school fence, and went inside to plan the next day's lessons. October arrived with the hard blue clarity that Wyoming delivered every year, like a pronouncement, the soft edges of summer gone. The air suddenly precise, the light changing angle and quality in a way that made familiar landscapes look slightly foreign and much more beautiful. Cole left for Cheyenne on the 3rd of October, riding the bay mare he'd named Patience, which was either descriptive or aspirational depending on the day. The ride was 60 miles. He did it in 2 days, camping one night on the open road with a fire and the stars overhead, which was not a hardship. He had camped on worse ground and worse weather. He carried 3 things: the saddle that had been his father's, his good shirt wrapped in oilcloth, and a letter from August Keene confirming his witness status and the date of his formal deposition before the federal land court. He arrived in Cheyenne on an October afternoon when the city was doing what cities do in fall: busier than summer, more purposeful, the particular energy of a place that understands winter is coming and intends to be ready. Cheyenne in 1884 was not a large city by Eastern standards, but it was the capital of the territory, and it wore that fact with the self-consciousness of a young place that knows it matters and is not yet entirely sure how to carry it. He checked into a boarding house near the land court. Clean, adequate, half the price of the hotels closer to the railroad. He had dinner alone and went to bed early and lay in the dark and thought about what he was going to say the next morning. He had told the story twice, once to Keene in the meadow on an evening in May, and once in the formal deposition that had started all of this. Each time the telling had been a different thing. The meadow version had been the opening of a door, tentative, cautious, offering what he had to someone he'd assessed and found trustworthy. The deposition had been the formal record, precise, documented, real, in the way that official things become real when they're written into federal ledgers. Tomorrow would be the court version, the version that would determine what happened to 14 families' claims, the version that Voss's attorneys would challenge. He thought about Ruth on the flats in October, the way she'd walk the property lines every fall, checking the fence posts, noting what needed repair before winter, knowing the land the way people know things they love completely without having to think about it. He thought about Miriam at her desk in the schoolhouse, grading papers, in the lamplight, her record book beside her. He thought about the major 7th chord, the one that wants to resolve, the one that always sounds like it's leaning towards somewhere. He went to sleep. The court was smaller than he'd expected. He didn't know what he'd expected, something grander, perhaps commensurate with the stakes. Instead, it was a plain room with wooden benches and a federal judge who looked tired in the way of men who hear complicated things all day and carry them home. There were lawyers. Keene had arranged federal representation for the claimants, which Cole had not asked for but was grateful for. Voss had 2 attorneys from Denver, expensive and precise. Cole sat in the witness chair and told the story. He had thought about this the night before, how to tell it. Not the form, the chronological facts were the facts, but the weight, how much to let through. He was a private man by nature. He had kept the story close for 5 years, not only out of practicality, but out of something that went deeper than practicality. The instinct that if he told it too fully, if he let people see all of what it had cost, he would somehow be giving that cost to the people listening, and they hadn't earned it. He told it fully. He told it about the October morning in 1879 when he'd ridden to the Laramie Land Office with his father's survey and his mother's hope and 3 years of savings. He told it about the notary, a young man nervous too quick. He told it about the stamp, the number, the way it had looked slightly off, but not wrong enough to flag. He told it about the letter that came 3 weeks later with the words procedural discrepancy in federal language and the world ending in bureaucratic prose. He told it about Ruth, about the photograph on the windowsill, about walking off the flats on a November morning with a saddle and $30 and 5 years of walking other men's land until he'd landed in Ridgeback Gulch and recognized in a dead woman's land deed copied into a schoolteacher's green ledger the mechanism of the same crime committed again. He told all of it, steadily, without drama, without performing the grief, just giving the facts the weight they actually had. The courtroom was very quiet when he was done. Voss's attorneys cross-examined for 40 minutes. They were thorough. They found no inconsistencies because there were none. Cole answered every question with the same level completeness with which he'd answered Keene's, no more, no less, exactly what was true. When they were done, he stepped down and went to the bench at the back of the room and sat there for the rest of the morning while other testimony was taken. He felt wrung out in the good way, the way of work properly finished. At noon, they recessed. Keene found him in the hallway. "Good," Keene said. "That was the whole of it." "Yes," Cole said. They shook hands and went in separate directions. Miriam gave her deposition 2 weeks after Cole, when the court proceedings had moved to a later phase. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, by identifying exactly what she knew and what she didn't know and what the relevant documents showed, and by refusing to say anything that was imprecise or approximate when precision was available. The court found her excellent. She had the record book. She had the dates. She had the sequence of her actions. When she'd found the deed, when she'd copied it, when she'd gone to Voss, when she'd come to Keene, laid out with the clarity of a person who does not confuse narrative convenience with factual accuracy. Voss's attorneys tried to suggest that she had coordinated with Cole before copying the deed notations. She explained patiently that the dates made this impossible. She'd copied the deed in the first week of April before Cole had arrived in Ridgeback Gulch. She had the surrounding entries in the record book to establish the timeline. Did the attorneys wish to examine the entries? They did not. She was on the stand for 2 hours. She came off it with the contained satisfaction of a task well executed. In the hallway outside the courtroom, she found Cole, who had ridden to Cheyenne again for her deposition, sitting on a bench reading a newspaper with the patient attention he gave everything. He looked up when she came out and read her face. "All right," he said. "Fine," she said. "They weren't very good lawyers. Better ones might have been harder." "I doubt it." She sat beside him on the bench. "They tried to suggest I'd coordinated with you before April." "What did you say?" "I said, look at the dates and we can settle that." He folded the newspaper. "You were ready for that." "I'm always ready," she said. "I have a system." He almost smiled. She had come to love the almost smile, which was the more honest version of the full one which he gave out sparingly, and which meant more for the rarity. They rode back to Ridgeback Gulch together, which had not been the plan exactly, but had become the plan naturally, the way many things between them became plans through the gravity of what they already were, rather than explicit decision. The road was 60 miles. They stopped once for water and to let the horses rest at a creek crossing where the cottonwoods were at their absolute peak, gold and violent and magnificent against the October blue. Cole said nothing about the cottonwoods. He looked at them for a long time. Miriam said, "Like the flats." He considered. "Different trees," he said. "Same light." She nodded. They rode the rest of the way largely in comfortable silence, which was one of the best things about him, that he understood silence as its own form of company rather than as the absence of conversation. She had not expected, when she decided to come west, to find a man who understood this. She had not been looking for a man who understood anything. She had been looking for a place to do good work and keep her balance. Both things, it turned out, were available in Ridgeback Gulch. They arrived back in town as the sun was going low, and Cole saw her to the schoolhouse and made sure Josephine was properly stabled and took his leave, and Miriam went inside and stood in her office for a moment in the last of the light. She thought, this is going somewhere. This has been going somewhere for a long time. A person could either manage that carefully or let it go where it was going. She was a careful person. She was learning a person who could afford, after a great deal of loss and a great deal of work, to let some things go where they were going. She sat down at the piano. She played the major 7th chord, the leaning one. Then she played the chord that followed the resolution, the one that answers the question, and it sounded in the empty schoolhouse at the end of October like exactly what it was in Arrival. The trial of Harlan Voss lasted 3 weeks in November. It was held in Cheyenne because the scale of the fraud, 3 counties, 14 families, 8 years of documented fraud, exceeded the jurisdiction of any territorial court in the affected areas. Federal Judge Warren Hollis presided. He was, Cole thought, on the one day he attended as a spectator rather than a witness, a man who had long ago made peace with the fact that legal proceedings involved more patience and paper than drama. He was good at his job because he understood that patience and paper were how justice actually moved. Cole was not required to attend the full trial. He had given his deposition. His role in the proceedings was complete on the legal side. He went once, sat in the back, listened for a morning, and came home. What he heard in that morning, there was the scope of it laid out in full. 14 families, 8,000 acres across 3 counties, $43,000 in estimated total fraud value at 1884 land prices. Names he didn't know: the Felter family in Carbon County, the Hendricks family in Albany, the Pierce family who had come from Ohio with their life savings and lost it all within 2 years of arrival. People he would never meet who had lived through the same storm that had hit the Dantrys in the same county by the same mechanism. He sat in the back of the courtroom and listened to the facts and felt with a clarity he hadn't expected that testifying had been the correct act regardless of what it cost him. Not because he was a righteous man who did righteous things, but because he was a man who had information that other people needed. And withholding information that other people need is a choice, and choices have consequences. and the consequence of that choice would have been those 14 families without recourse. He went home to Ridgeback Gulch. The trial concluded in early December with a verdict on all 14 counts of land fraud. Harlan Voss was convicted on 12 of the 14 and sentenced to 8 years in the territorial prison. The Denver attorneys appealed. The appeal was denied in the spring. Voss served his sentence. None of the land could be fully restored. Several parcels had been resold to third parties who'd purchased in good faith, and the law protected their titles. The federal government established a compensation fund for families who couldn't recover their land directly. The Dantry review was processed as part of the larger case, and Cole's 320 acres, the eastern half of the flats, the half that was still technically under territorial holding, was returned to the Dantry title by March of the following year. He went out to the flats the morning the title came through, which was a Thursday in March. The first cold of spring, turning slowly to something else, the creek running clear and fast with snow melt. He rode the perimeter and stood for a while at the south fence line near the creek and thought about his father who had died before any of this and about Ruth who had lived through all of it. He turned the horse toward home. He was for the first time in 5 years turning toward a home that was his. He started on the house in April. The original structure had been a 2-room cabin built by his grandfather in 1857 and added to twice by his father a 3rd room, a sleeping loft, a porch that faced south to catch the afternoon light. The bones were sound. He tore out what had rotted, which was more than he'd hoped and less than he'd feared, and started rebuilding from the studs out. He worked alone mostly, which was his preference for the kind of work that requires sustained thought. But he had help on the heavy days. The Garner sons came for the beam work, which required 4 hands. Hatch showed up on 2 Saturdays with his sleeves rolled up and a willingness to hold things steady while Cole nailed them. A rancher from the west boundary, a man named Elbert Crow, who had lost his own land to a different kind of fraud 20 years earlier and had been quietly watching the Voss proceedings with particular attention, came one week and helped with the foundation chinking and didn't say much but worked steadily and well. Ruth came out on a warm day in May when the frame was up and the roof was on and there was enough of a structure to see what it would be. Cole helped her from the wagon and she stood in what would be the main room, the south-facing room with the space for a large window, and she looked around at the bare studs and the daylight coming through the gaps where the interior walls would go, and she said nothing for a long time. Cole waited. "Your father built the first version in 6 weeks," she said finally. "He was terrible with a level." "I know." The door frame in the old room was 2 degrees off plumb for 20 years. She paused. "I miss it." "I know, Mama." She walked slowly on Cole's arm to the south wall, where the window would go, and stood in the space and looked out at the creek and the cottonwoods and the grass going green in the May morning. "It's the same," she said. "The light." "Yes," Cole said. She was quiet for a while. "Bring me out again when the window's in," she said. "I want to see the light through the glass." "All right." He brought her out in June when the window was in, and she stood in the room and watched the afternoon light come through the glass and lay itself across the new floor, which Cole had laid himself in good pine level and true every joint tight. She died in July. It was not unexpected, and it was not as terrible as Cole had feared, which he'd been told was how these things sometimes went. She died on a Thursday afternoon in her room at the Peck boarding house, in the bed she'd had for 2.5 years with Cole on one side and Delia Peck on the other, and the window open to the July air. She had been talking to Cole for the previous half hour about the garden she'd kept at the flats, what she'd planted, what had grown, what the deer had gotten to despite everything. She was very clear about all of it. Then she stopped talking and looked at the window for a while, and then she was gone as quietly as she'd done most things. Cole sat beside her for a long time. He was not going to write about this part, the sitting, the quiet, the particular weight of the room after. Some things don't need to be made into words. They are the thing itself without translation. He came out eventually and told Delia Peck, who said, "Oh, Cole," in the plain way of a woman who has seen loss and knows there is nothing to say that helps and says the human thing anyway. He walked up the hill to the schoolhouse. Miriam was at her desk when he knocked. She looked at his face. She didn't ask. She stood and came around the desk and put her arms around him, and he stood there in the schoolhouse office with his chin on top of her head and her arms around him in the July afternoon coming through the windows, and he did not cry. He was not a man who cried easily, but something in him, the long-held thing, the 5 years of being the one who carried everything, loosened just slightly in the particular way of things that have been held too tight for too long. He stayed for a while. Then he straightened up And she stepped back, and he said, "Thank you." She said she was remarkable. "Yes," he said. They sat together in the office until the light went, and she made coffee, and they talked about Ruth. Really talk specific and full the way you talk about people when you're trying to keep them present in the world through the power of being remembered well. That evening, on the way back to the boarding house, Cole stopped at the rise above the town and looked at the country. The flats were 14 miles south. Ridgeback Gulch lay below him. Miriam's light was on in the schoolhouse. He thought she would want to know what happens next. He thought I'd better make it worth knowing. Cole had one piece of luggage for the ride to Cheyenne. It was not technically luggage. It was a saddlebag, old and mended in 3 places, that had been his father's working bag and was the kind of object that accumulates significance slowly over decades of use until it weighs more than its contents. Inside it, the good shirt folded in oilcloth, the letter from Keene, a copy of the federal filing summary that established his stake in the case, the small Bible with his mother's name inside, which he took with him on journeys of more than a day as a form of company that didn't require conversation. He had also, on a separate piece of paper folded into the Bible's back pages, the list of everyone he knew to have been affected by Voss's scheme, the 14 families, their names, the approximate dates and locations of their losses. Keene had not given him this list. Cole had assembled it himself over the previous 2 months from the federal filings, which were public record in the Territorial Land Office, and from 2 other witnesses who had, after Cole's deposition became known, come forward and spoken to him directly. He had no particular use for the list. He was not going to testify on their behalf. He'd been a direct witness only to his own case. But he had found that having the names written in his own hand made the thing he was doing feel properly sized. Not his story, the story of which his was a piece. He carried the list to Cheyenne and back. He kept it for the rest of his life. The 60-mile ride back from Cheyenne in October was the longest sustained time Cole and Miriam had spent in each other's company since the lessons had been their primary structure. Without the lesson framework, the defined roles, the clear agenda, the narrow bench, they had to simply be 2 people on a road together, which was either easier or harder than the structured thing depending on the mile. It was, as it turned out, considerably easier. They talked about that case some and then left it behind. They talked about the road, the landscape, the particular quality of October in this country that was different from October anywhere else, the way the light came low and hard and made everything more itself, more specifically what it was. She told him about October in Philadelphia, which was also beautiful, but differently in the particular way of a city coming inside for the season. He told her about October on the flats, which she had not seen yet. "Yet," she said. He looked at her. "You said yet," she said, "as though I'll see it. Won't you?" She was quiet for a moment. The horses moved through the afternoon, steady and patient, the grass on either side gone gold. "The flats is 320 acres, she said. 320, eastern half, good creek access on the south boundary. And the plan is to build there." "The plan is building," he said, "spring if the title clears on time." She nodded. She was looking at the road ahead. "Does the eastern half have cottonwoods?" "Along the creek, 20, 30 trees, old ones." "Like those?" She gestured at the stand they were passing. "Like those," he said. She looked at the cottonwoods. He looked at her, looking at them. "Yes," he said. "You'll see it." She didn't answer, but she didn't argue, which was the same thing. Deputy Clem Hatch attended every day of the trial, which he was not required to do. He went on his own time on a borrowed horse, leaving Potter to manage Ridgeback's law business for the 3 weeks of November. He went because he believed a man who makes a mistake has an obligation to understand the full size of the mistake. Not to punish himself, self-punishment was indulgent and useless, but to measure it honestly and carry that measurement as a permanent calibration. What he had done was not illegal. He had passed along a suspicion to a deputy. He had not manufactured evidence or filed false charges. He had questioned Cole on the basis of a reported sighting, which was within his duties, and he had not pressed the charge when it became clear it wouldn't hold. He had in fact been one of the people who let it drop quickly. But he had been used. He had been used because he'd made himself available to be used, because his relationship with Voss had been one of deference rather than independent judgment, and he had allowed that deference to function as a kind of implicit cooperation without ever signing his name to anything. He sat in the back of the courtroom in Cheyenne and listened to 3 weeks of testimony and thought about the difference between being honest and being willing to be honest. He had been honest. He had not lied. He had for a long time simply chosen not to look at things that would have required him to act. Cole Dantry had looked at things and acted on what he saw. Hatch was not sure, sitting in the back of that courtroom, that he would have done the same in Cole's position. He thought he'd like to believe he would have. He didn't know. What he did know was that when the moment had come, when the marshals had arrived and the arrest needed to happen, and Hatch was standing in the doorway of the land office, he had stepped forward. It was not enough, but it was something. He rode back to Ridgeback Gulch on the last day of the trial and went to his office and sat at his desk for a while. Then he took out the paper he used for filing formal reports and wrote a letter to Cole Dantry. The letter said, "I should have seen it sooner. I'm sorry. If there's anything in my power to do toward making it right, I will. Hatch." He left it at the boarding house. Cole read it. He thought about it. Then he wrote back, "Come help me put up the roof frame in April. Bring your own tools. Dantry." Hatch came. Ruth died on the 14th of July. Cole wrote to no one about it. There was no one to write to except Miriam, who already knew, and Keene, who had met Ruth once and sent a brief and dignified note when he heard, and the Prentice Creek land agent, who needed formal notification that her estate had cleared. He had one other thing to do: the letter to the families. He had been thinking about it for months, whether to write, what to say, whether it was presumption. He was not a man who wrote letters. He was not a man who thought his feelings on a matter were particularly of interest to others. But the list of names in the back of the Bible had been there for months, and after Ruth died, he found himself on a quiet August evening at the flats, the house mostly done, the windows in the room still empty, but habitable, taking out the list and reading through it. He wrote 14 letters. He did not say much in any of them. He said, "I was one of the 14. I testified. I wanted you to know the case was made with all of your situations in mind, not just mine. If the restoration proceeding offers you anything, I hope you get it. If it doesn't, I'm sorry for that too. The land matters. You were right to fight for it." He sent them through the federal land court, which had current addresses for all 14 families. He received 11 responses. Several were brief: "Thank you, we know, we're glad it was pursued." 2 were longer. One was from the Pierce family in Albany County, who had come from Ohio and lost everything within 2 years of arrival and had never recovered their land. The father wrote, "I didn't think anyone would ever make it count. My wife says to tell you thank you from her. She means it more than I can say." Cole folded that letter and put it with the list in the back of the Bible. He sat on the unfinished porch of the Flats homestead in the August evening and looked at the creek and the cottonwoods and the land, thought about his father and his mother and the Pierce family from Ohio and the 14 other families and the long chain of small and large choices that had brought all of them to where they were. He thought Ruth would have said something sensible about this. He thought I'd like to hear what Miriam would say about this. He got on his horse and rode 14 miles to Ridgeback Gulch. He woke early in the Cheyenne boarding house and dressed in the good shirt and looked at himself in the small mirror above the wash basin. He looked like what he was, a man who had spent a long time outside. The sun had marked his face with the honesty of weather. His hands were the hands of a working man. His eyes were, he thought, the eyes of someone who had been paying attention for a long time and had come to some conclusions. He thought about what Miriam had said in the first week of lessons: "You play what you mean." You could always tell what he meant. He'd meant contentment. Cole straightened his collar. He thought, what do I mean? He thought, I mean what I'm doing. I mean the land and the testimony and the 14 families and my mother's lungs in the major 7th chord that wants to resolve. I mean all of that, and I mean the specific gray-eyed woman in a Wyoming schoolhouse who copies important documents into a green ledger and leaves plates of food on boarding house steps and goes 3 miles on horseback to federal offices when she has evidence that needs delivering. He meant a future that was facing the right direction. He put on his hat and went downstairs. He moved out to the flats at the end of August once the house was habitable, which meant a roof that didn't leak windows, that closed against the weather, a functioning stove, and a floor that was level. These were his requirements for habitable. Miriam had raised an eyebrow when he'd explained the definition, and he'd said, "What would you add?" And she'd said, "Curtains." And he'd looked at her for a moment and then said he'd see to curtains. He moved his things, the saddle, the tobacco tin with its current $11.40. The Bible, the saddlebag, on a Wednesday morning in late August, loaded onto Patience's back, which was not a large amount of worldly goods for a man of 34, but was, he thought, the correct amount for this particular stage of the operation. The next stage would have more. The first night alone at the flats, he sat on the south porch in the dark and listened to the creek. It ran over the same stones it had always run over. The sound was the same. He had dreamed of this specific sound in the walking years without knowing he was dreaming of it, had woken in strange bunkhouses with the memory of water sound and not been able to place it. He placed it now. He stayed on the porch until the stars reached their highest point and then went inside and slept in a room that was his. He slept well. The verdict came on a Thursday. Cole heard it in Ridgeback Gulch from Keene's telegram, which arrived at the post office and was brought to the schoolhouse by the postmaster's son, who knew that Cole was at the school that morning, helping Miriam with a stuck window that had frozen shut in the first cold snap of November. He read the telegram. 12 of 14 counts, convicted, sentencing in 1 week. He showed it to Miriam. She read it and handed it back. Good, she said. He folded it. Does it help? She said. Knowing, he thought about that. It was a real question, not a rhetorical one she wanted to know, with the genuine curiosity she had about things that mattered to her. Some things don't need to be helped, he said. They just need to be finished. He put the telegram in his shirt pocket. This is finished. She nodded. She turned back to the window, which was still stuck. Will you give it another try, she said. The window. He got his hands on the frame. The window opened. Cole's first full year at the flats followed the rhythm that good land follows not, dramatic, just seasonal, a way of things that are well and properly placed. In September, after the title cleared, he planted winter wheat in the south field along the creek. It was a small planting. He had limited seed money and was being realistic about what a single man could manage in the first season. But it was wheat on his own land, and watching it go in the ground was the first act of the future rather than of surviving the present. In October, after the ride to Cheyenne with Miriam, he came back and found that the wheat was showing the first green, and he stood at the edge of the field in the October light and felt something that took him a moment to name ordinary contentment. Not the fierce, grasping relief of having survived, just the plain satisfaction of a thing done right and going well. In November, he finished the interior walls of the house while the Voss trial ran its course in Cheyenne. He put up the curtains not without some private amusement at the fact that he was putting up curtains which he would not have anticipated a year earlier. They were plain muslin, practical and adequate. He'd purchased them from the dry goods store and put them up himself, and they were 2 degrees off level, which he noticed and declined to fix in a private tribute to his father's doorframe. In December, the house was done. The title was cleared. The first snow came on a Tuesday afternoon, and he was inside with the stove going when it arrived, watching it through the south window, the good window, the one Ruth had stood at in June, as it came across the grass in the particular silent way of the first snow, which seems to announce the season without drama, simply by beginning. He thought, this is where I live now. He thought, this is home. He got on Patience and rode 14 miles to Ridgeback Gulch for Sunday dinner. The argument about the land came in February. Cole had been at the flats for 6 months by then, riding into Ridgeback Gulch on Sundays, and as the winter went on, with increasing frequency. Wednesdays for no particular reason other than that Wednesday was the middle of the week, and the middle of the week seemed increasingly like a reasonable time to be in Ridgeback Gulch. He had not formally noted this increase in visits or assigned it a meaning. He had simply found himself saddling Patience on Wednesday mornings. Miriam, for her part, had begun riding out to the flats on occasional Saturday afternoons to look at what he was doing with the place and to eat the meals he cooked, which were simple and good, the cooking of a man who had fed himself for years and knew what worked. She had brought on 3 of these visits, the record book and a stack of papers, working at his kitchen table while he worked outside, which was a comfortable arrangement that neither of them had designed. The South parcel argument began when she mentioned one Saturday in February that she'd had an offer on the Prentice Creek land. He looked up from the stove. From who? A rancher from the North County. He wants the water rights, specifically the creek frontage. The rest he'd leave fallow. She set down her pen. The offer is good. Are you going to take it? I don't know. She looked at him across the table. What do you think? He thought about it. What do you want to do with it? He said. Not what the offer is. What do you want? She was quiet for a moment. I want to use it well, she said. I want something to be happening on it. I don't like good land sitting idle. She paused. But teaching is my work, not ranching. Then the right answer isn't to sell the water rights to a stranger, he said. What's the right answer? He looked at her. She looked at him. Lease it to someone you trust, he said. Someone with a use for creek frontage and a ranch that abuts the property. She tilted her head slightly. That would be you. That would be me, yes. I offered you that before, she said. In August. You refused. I refused before I had my own land, he said. The situation is different now. Is it? Yes. He turned back to the stove, stirring something. I have 320 acres and a title and a house that doesn't leak. Leasing your south parcel isn't standing on borrowed ground anymore. It's extending an operation that's already established. He paused. It's different. She was quiet for a long time. 50 cents an acre per year, she said, for the south 160 acres. 5-year term renewable. He turned to look at her. Fair market's 40. I know what fair market is, she said. I'm setting the terms. Miriam, Cole. Her voice was level and precise. The extra 10 cents covers the water access, which is above average. If you want to negotiate, offer me 45. He looked at her. She looked at him with the gray eyes and the school teacher's face that showed nothing she didn't intend to show. He had spent 8 months learning to read what she intended to show. He was still learning. 45, and he said. Done, she said, and picked up her pen. He turned back to the stove and was quiet for a moment. Miriam, he said. Yes. Thank you. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice had the warmth she rationed carefully and gave most fully when she wasn't performing it. The land should be used, she said. That's all. He nodded. The stove was quiet. The February light came through the south window. Outside, the flats lay under the last of the winter, cold and still, and in the particular way of dormant land, full of what it was going to be. The formal piano lessons had stopped in October when the move to the flats had changed the geography of their evenings. But Cole still sat with Miriam at the piano when he was in Ridgeback Gulch, and what they did there had evolved from lessons into something else, a shared practice, unhurried, where she played pieces she loved, and he worked slowly through the things he was learning, and neither of them was teacher or student particularly. In March, on a Wednesday evening, he played the major 7th chord for the first time unprompted, not as an exercise, not as a demonstration, but as the beginning of something. He sat at the piano alone. Miriam was in the back room making tea and played the chord, and then played it again, and then let his right hand try to find where it wanted to go from there. He found the resolution. Hesitantly, imprecisely, with a pause in the middle where he wasn't sure, but he found it. The chord that follows, the arrival. He sat there with his hands on the keys. Miriam came in with the tea and saw him at the piano, and set the cups down quietly without speaking. She sat beside him on the bench. He was still looking at the keys. You found the resolution, she said. Eventually. That's how it usually happens. He looked at his hands. What's the name of that chord? It's called the tonic, she said. Home key. The chord the piece is built around. The one that makes everything else make sense. He was quiet. Cole, she said. He turned to look at her. She was very close to the narrow bench, the familiar proximity. The lamplight. The March evening outside. The Wyoming winter finally turning, toward whatever came next. I have been in love with you since approximately August, she said. I want you to know that. He was still for a moment. Then he said September for me. August I was still arguing with myself. What were you arguing about? Whether I had any right to it, he said. The answer turned out to be that it wasn't a question of rights. No, she said, it wasn't. He took her hand. She turned it over and held his. They sat at the piano for a long time without playing anything. Outside, the March wind came across the flats 14 miles south. The cottonwoods along the creek were beginning to bud, barely visible, the first green hint of what was coming. In the schoolhouse, they couldn't see that from here, but they both knew it was happening. Ridgeback Gulch, as a community, had been aware of the situation between Cole Dantry and Miriam Ashford for considerably longer than either of them might have wished. Clara Hewitt had noted the Wednesday visits in October and reported them to Dora Sanger over the counter of the dry goods store. Dora Sanger had mentioned them to Agatha Marsh at the church social. Agatha Marsh had mentioned them to her husband, the Reverend, who had been professionally obliged not to speculate, but had personally formed a view and quietly approved of it. Delia Peck had watched the development from the beginning with the particular satisfaction of someone who had suspected the outcome before either participant had accepted it and who had been patient enough to wait and see rather than comment. She told the boarding house at large on a March evening, about time. No one at the table knew what she was referring to specifically. Several of them had a general idea and nodded. The Garner family, who had seen Cole work for 6 weeks on their fence and knew him as a man of quality and sense, approved. Elbert Crow, the rancher from the west boundary, had met Miriam twice and found her direct and competent, which were his primary criteria. Hatch, who had worked alongside Cole on the flat's roof and had thus heard in the particular extended conversations that happened during shared physical labor, a good deal about Cole's views on a wide range of subjects, thought the match made sense and said so to Potter when the subject came up. Even the men at the saloon who had initially been divided on Cole's testimony against Voss had largely resolved in his favor by the spring, partly because the full scope of Voss's scheme had made even the skeptics uncomfortable, and partly because Cole Dantry was demonstrably the kind of man who showed up, did what he said, and left things better than he found them, which was the fundamental requirement for standing in a frontier community. None of this commentary reached Cole or Miriam directly. Small towns are in practice better at observation than communication. They watched and noted and formed their views and generally left the principals to arrive at their own conclusions in their own time, which they had done. It was April, a full year after Cole had first walked into Ridgeback Gulch with a saddle over his shoulder and 31 cents in his pocket when he asked. He had thought about how to do this for 3 months. He had thought about the right time and the right place and the right words, and he had concluded, which was consistent with how he operated in general, that the right words were the true words, and the right place was wherever felt honest, and the right time was when the question was ready. The question was ready on a Sunday in April in the early afternoon, when they were walking the boundary of the Prentice Creek land together, she doing her landowner's check of the spring fencing, he doing his tenant's assessment of the creek level, which was high from snowmelt and running beautifully. They stopped at the south fence line near the cottonwoods. The creek ran below them, loud and clean. The cottonwoods were leafing 10 days ahead of last year, which Cole had noted and approved of. The land was greening not all the way, but visibly the way it does in April in Wyoming, when the spring is real and not a false start. He had the question with him. He had been carrying it for 3 months. He took it out now. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. She had learned across 11 months to read when he was at the edge of something important. She gave him the quiet she knew he needed. "The flats and the Prentice Creek South parcel share a fence line," he said. "That's going to mean over the next 5 years considerable coordination on water management and grazing rotation and probably a dozen other practical matters." She waited. "It seems to me," he said, "that the most efficient arrangement would be one household rather than two, which is 14 miles apart." She was quiet for a moment. The creek ran. The cottonwoods moved in the April air. "Is that a proposal," she said, "or a ranch management suggestion?" "Both," he said. "One follows from the other." She looked at the creek. He waited. "I'm a teacher," she said. "I'm going to keep teaching." "I know. The school is in Ridgeback, which is 14 miles from the flats." "I know. You'd be doing the 14 miles." "Yes. In winter, too." "Most winters." She almost smiled. "Most winters," she said. "The flats needs work in the evenings and on weekends. The school is during the day. It's manageable." "You've thought about this?" "I've thought about it since September," he said, "when I was still arguing with myself about rights." She turned to look at him. The gray eyes at the full inventory look moved over him in the complete way she had. He stood still and let her look. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right," she said again. "Yes." He reached over and took her hand. She turned it over and held his. They stood at the fence line with the Prentice Creek running below them and the cottonwoods in new leaf and the April Wyoming morning enormous and clear around them, and neither of them said anything else for a while because there wasn't anything that needed saying. The land knew, the creek knew, the cottonwoods that had been there since long before either of them and would be there long after had seen this kind of thing before the careful and the patient standing at a fence line in April finally arrived. They were married in June in Ridgeback Gulch's white-painted church on the hill, with Reverend Marsh officiating and the entire town in attendance, which was standard for a community of 340 people where everyone knew everyone, and weddings were the public affirmation of something the community had been watching develop for a year. Miriam wore a dress she'd had since Philadelphia silk, deep blue-gray, the color of Wyoming twilight that she'd carried west in a trunk and preserved through 3 moves with the systematic care she gave to important things. She had not known when she'd packed it what occasion would call for it. She had brought it because you brought the important things even when you didn't know yet what they were important for. Cole wore his good shirt. He'd had it pressed by Delia Peck, who had done it with ceremony, and the private satisfaction of someone who had watched a story reach its proper ending. Ruth's photograph from the windowsill was there. Cole had brought it, set it on the front pew in the morning sun before anyone else arrived, so she'd be present in the way she could be. After the ceremony, they walked out into the June afternoon in the town of Ridgeback Gulch, did what small towns do on such occasions. It ate, drank, played music, and expressed its collective pleasure at the occasion, with the generosity of a community that has been through difficult things together and knows how to celebrate the good ones. Hatch, who had been asked by Cole to stand with him, stood up straight in his deputy's badge and shook Cole's hand after the ceremony with the particular firmness of a man making a compact. Cole shook back. Keene had sent a letter from Cheyenne. It said, "Well done, on all counts. Keene." In the evening after the guests had gone, Cole and Miriam stood on the porch of the schoolhouse, her house which would remain hers to use for her work, and looked at the Wyoming evening going slowly from gold to blue. "The flats tomorrow," she said. "Whenever you're ready," he said. She leaned against him. His arm went around her. They stood there while the stars came out one by one, the way they always did, the way they'd been doing over Wyoming since long before either of them was born, and would go on doing long after. The creek 14 miles south was running in the dark. The cottonwoods were full and heavy with June. The winter wheat Cole had planted in September was in and tall and would be ready by August. The land was his again, and the land finally was full, 5 years later. The Dantry Ranch, which was what it was called, now on the county maps and in the common speech of the people who knew it, covered 480 acres, Cole's original, 320 plus. The Prentice Creek South parcel, which the 5-year lease had converted in year 4 to a permanent arrangement when Miriam had decided that managing 2 separate land titles for what functioned as a single operation was the kind of inefficiency she found intolerable. They had combined the titles. The paperwork had taken 3 months. It was done right. The house had grown. Not dramatically. Cole was not a man who built beyond his needs, but a 4th room had been added when it became clear that the school's occasional student boarders needed somewhere to stay, and a proper porch had gone on the south side where Ruth's south window still faced the cottonwoods and the creek. There was a barn, a chicken house, and a kitchen garden that produced more than the 2 of them could eat and was distributed with Miriam's systematic attention to anyone in the county who needed it. Miriam still taught school. She would teach school for another 20 years, eventually becoming the school board's first female member, a position she held with the same brisk, fair-minded competence she brought to everything. Several of her students went on to schools in Cheyenne and Denver. One went to Philadelphia for university, which she found satisfying in a way she couldn't entirely explain. The record book, The Green Ledger, was full by 1887. She started a second one. Cole ran the ranch with the methodical patience that was his fundamental nature. He was good at it, not spectacularly prosperous, not famous for it, but consistently good, fair with his hands, careful with his water rights, attentive to the land in the way of people who have lost land and know what it means. He became in time someone the younger ranchers in the county asked for advice, which he gave plainly and without charging for it. He never sold the saddle. He kept it in the barn, oiled and maintained, hung on its proper hook. It was not a working saddle anymore. He'd bought a proper working saddle in 1885, but it hung where he could see it when he came in every morning, and he found this correct. A man should be able to see what he came from. It helps to know the distance you've traveled. On Sunday evenings, when the week's work was done and the light was going long and golden over the Wyoming grass, Cole and Miriam sat on the south porch. The creek ran below in the cottonwoods. The cattle were settled in the pasture. The kitchen garden smelled of what it was growing. The country was enormous and quiet in the way it always was, the way it would go on being long after them. Miriam had her book. Cole had the view which he never got tired of. They talked some, and were quiet some the way people talk and are quiet when they've known each other long enough that both are easy. There was a piano now at the flats, too, a used upright they'd bought from a family moving east in 1886, hauled 14 miles on a wagon with considerable effort, and installed in the 4th room, which had turned out to serve several purposes. Cole played in the evenings sometimes. He was not skilled, he would never be skilled, but he had the major 7th chord in the tonic that followed, and the handful of other chords he'd learned in the years since, and when he sat down, he played them the way Edmund Ashford had played, Miriam said, imperfectly with meaning. One evening in October, the 5th year, Miriam set down her book and looked at him. "You're playing better," she said. "I had a good teacher." "You still do," she said. He looked at her. The gray eyes in the lamplight in the October evening 5 years on from the first rainy porch, and the coffee and the careful silence of 2 people noticing each other for the first time. He played the major 7th, the leaning chord, the one that sounds like it's headed somewhere. Then he played the tonic. Home key, the arrival. "Yes," he said, "I do." The stars came out over Wyoming the way they always did. The land held as good land does. The creek ran and ran and ran. Cola had thought in the walking years that the loss of the flats had been primarily an economic catastrophe. Land was wealth. Wealth was the mechanism of survival. Losing it was losing the means of the future. He understood by the time he was working the south parcel and growing the winter wheat and watching the spring come in on ground that was his, that this was only part of it. The other part was harder to quantify and more essential. Land is a relationship. You care for it, it carries you. You learn its particular qualities where it drains well and where it holds water, where the grass grows thickest, where the frost comes earliest, where the deer come in the evening. You know these things not because you have been told them, but because you've been there season after season paying attention. And the knowing is a form of belonging that is not about ownership in the legal sense, but about the particular bond between a person and the ground they've worked and loved and will work and love again. He had been without that bond for 5 years. He had not had a word for what was missing. He had one now. He was standing at the south fence line near the creek on a May morning, assessing the water level when Miriam's horse came over the rise from the Ridgeback Road. She was riding Josephine, who had developed over 2 years into an excellent trail horse with opinions about mud that she expressed with her ears. Miriam had learned to read Josephine's ear positions with the same careful attention she gave everything. She dismounted at the fence and came to stand beside him. They looked at the creek together. "Hi," she said. "Good snowmelt year. It'll hold through July." She nodded. She had learned creek reading from him the way she'd learned riding with the systematic attention of a person who intends to know what she's doing and will accept no approximation. "How's the north pasture coming?" "The garner hands finished yesterday. I want to ride the fence myself this afternoon to check the corners." She was quiet for a moment looking at the water. "I was thinking," she said, "about next spring." He waited. "The east field," she said. "If the wheat does well this season, which it's going to, the growth pattern is strong, you'll have seed to expand. The east field has the sun exposure for it." He had been thinking the same thing. He had not said it to her, which was an error he recognized. He had defaulted to keeping his own counsel on ranch matters out of habit, when in fact she had consistently sharp views and useful angles. "You're right," he said. She looked at him. Just like that. "You're right," he said again. "I should have said something 2 weeks ago when I was thinking it." "Yes," she agreed, "you should have." Not a reprimand, just an accurate observation. She turned back to the creek. "We should talk about the east field properly, this week." "Yes." They stood at the fence line for a while longer, watching the Prentice Creek run. In the May morning, the two of them looking at land that was both of theirs legally, financially, and in the other harder to quantify sense, the essential sense. March in Wyoming is the season of false starts. The temperature lifts for a week, something green appears, and then the cold comes back with the particular brutality of weather that has decided not to be finished yet. It snows in April some years. The flats knew this. Cole knew this. He planted nothing in March and trusted nothing in March and accepted what March offered with the patience he brought to things that couldn't be hurried. He was on the flats when March offered its one good thing, which was the Wednesday evening when Miriam rode out. She'd gotten good enough on Josephine to make the 14 miles without it being a hardship, which Cole admired without saying so, and found him finishing the last of the interior work on the 4th room. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room. "This is going to be where," she said. "Whoever needs it," he said. "Students you're boarding. Keen if he comes back through. Hatch if he needs somewhere away from Potter." He paused. "My mother had a room at the Peck boarding house for 2.5 years. I'd rather have the room here." She looked at him. "That's a kind thought," she said. "It's a practical one," he said. "The kind and the practical are the same thing sometimes." She came into the room and looked at the new wall he'd put up, which was straight and level in both dimensions. She ran her hand along it. He watched her do this, the particular attention she brought to the physical world, which was precise without being cold. "Cole," she said. "Yes." "I've been thinking." He waited. "This room needs a window on the east side," she said. "The morning light here would be extraordinary." He looked at the east wall. He hadn't planned a window there. He thought about it now. "Yes," he said, "it would be." "I'll help you frame it," she said. "I know how." He looked at her. "You taught me about roofs," she said. "I've been paying attention to framing since." She picked up the spare hammer from the work table and turned it in her hand with the ease of someone who had figured out the grip. "Show me where you want the sill." He showed her. They put in the east window together, which took most of the evening, and the March cold came in through the opening while they worked, and the March stars were visible through the space they were creating, And when the window was framed and ready for glass, Cole stood back and looked at it and thought, this room is going to have the morning light on it every day from now on. He thought she is going to be in this house every day from now on. He thought I am going to ask her. Not yet. In April, when the land was ready to make the future visible, when the question had time to become the words it needed to be. He stood in the March room with the framed window and the stars coming through, and he was, for the moment, content to wait. The community's collective view of the Dantry Ashford development was not uniformly positive, which was honest. 3 households had their reservations, which they expressed to each other and not publicly. The Reverend's wife, Agatha, had a view about the pace of the thing, which she kept to herself after her husband reminded her that the couple in question were both in their late 30s and had each lost a great deal and were entitled to whatever pace felt right to them. Clara Hewitt, to her credit, revised her opinion of the situation entirely and told Dora Sanger one March afternoon, I was wrong about Voss. If Miriam Ashford saw through him and I didn't, I should pay more attention to what she sees in the Dantry man. This was for Clara Hewitt a significant statement and was received as such. The most meaningful community endorsement came from the 14 ranch families in the county who had lost nothing to Voss, who had been untouched by the scheme, who had watched the testimony and the trial from a safe distance, and who in the spring after the conviction began directing their fencing and carpentry work to Cole Dantry when they needed it done. It was not a formal endorsement. Nobody made a speech. But in a county where the economy moved through word of mouth and personal recommendation, the distribution of work was a statement. It said, this man is one of us. He can be trusted. We want him here. Cole took the work. He did it well, as he always had. He said nothing about the redistribution, except to note when Miriam pointed it out one evening that he was getting busier. Good, she said. I'll need to hire someone, he said, in the fall if it keeps up. Probably, she said. Is that a problem? No, he said. It's a good problem. It was, she thought, a way of describing things she appreciated in him, the ability to correctly classify problems as good or bad, which was not a small skill and not an obvious one. He had planned the proposal for a Sunday. It became a Tuesday. The Tuesday happened because the creek fencing needed checking, and she offered to help. And they ended up at the south boundary in the late morning, with the April air clean and clear, and the cottonwoods in bud, and the question which had been sitting in his chest for 3 months decided it was ready. He had thought he would say it differently. He had thought in the abstract planning that there would be more ceremony to it. He had considered briefly going to Cheyenne for a ring and had concluded that Miriam Ashford was not a woman who required a ring in order to understand what was being asked. She would want the words to be true. That was her primary criterion for most things. He said what was true: the flats and the Prentice Creek South Parcel and the fence line in one household rather than 2 and 14 miles in most winters. The ranch management logic. She had called it what it was, both a proposal and a ranch management suggestion. He had said yes, one follows from the other. What he hadn't said, standing at the fence line in April, what he said later on the porch of the flats on the evening of the same day with the sunset doing its Wyoming thing, and the creek audible in the cottonwoods was the other part. The part that was not ranch management. He said, I want you to know I mean more than the practical part. She was quiet. The practical part is true, he said. But the reason it's true is not efficiency. The reason it's true is that you are the person I want to come home to every day for the rest of however long we have. She turned to look at him. I know, she said quietly. I know that, Cole. I wanted to say it plainly, he said, once, for the record. She smiled, the real one, the full one, the one that changed her face entirely and that he'd been watching appear more and more freely for a year. Your record, she said, or mine. Both, he said. She put her hand in his. The sun went down over Wyoming and the stars came out and the creek ran and the land held as it had always held, as it would go on holding.